call the meeting to order, please? It's after 1, so we're going to move ahead. Pledge of Allegiance, I see by Commissioner Bowden, so will you please stand for the pledge? Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. This is our workshop on affordable workforce housing, and we're anxious to hear all about it and how we can solve and resolve this. The presentation on affordable housing needs within Indian River County. We have a presentation discussion of new innovative housing strategies by the Community Land Trust is the first one. And can you introduce Bob, okay.
Good morning. I'm Bob Keating. I'm Indian River County Community Development Director, and for once I will not be sitting in the front row today. We have better, smarter, more eloquent people to be there today. But I do want to tell you, this is an affordable housing workshop. This isn't the first one that we've had. We've had others over the years. We really had our first affordable housing workshop back in 1997. And we had another affordable housing workshop in 2001. And we now have a workshop scheduled for today, and we've got some really great, knowledgeable people who I think are going to bring us a lot of resources to help us maybe not only identify the magnitude of the affordable housing issue, but also present some of the strategies that we have for solving some of the affordable housing problems. Let me just tell you who we have here today, and they can provide their own backgrounds. I don't have their resumes, so I can't give them a real great introduction, but I can tell you who we do have here. We have Stan Fitterman, who is with the Florida Housing Coalition. And we also have Gladys Snyder, who's with the Florida Housing Coalition. They're going to be able to give you a lot of good information on some of the strategies you may not be too familiar with. Then we've got Bill O'Dell from the Schimberg Center for Affordable Housing, who is an expert on housing and affordable housing data and information. Hopefully he's going to give us a lot of information that will clarify the magnitude of the issue. We've got Greg Viday, who a lot of you probably know from the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. He's going to give us a regional perspective on affordable housing. And we have Jim Goldsmith from the local Coalition for Affordable Housing. There's Jim. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill O'Dell.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for having me. Sasan told me that I was here almost exactly 10 years ago giving a similar presentation. I can tell you that the numbers have changed considerably since then. But what I'm going to do today, could I have the next slide? What I'm going to do today is just give you a brief overview of what we typically produce in the way of an affordable housing needs assessment. And we're going to talk about 4 or 5 things. One, I'm going to the extent that some of you don't know some of the concepts that we typically use, I'm going to go through just very briefly talking about what we mean by affordable housing, but particularly issues of cost burden and income. I'm going to give you some numbers that reflect our estimates of the affordable housing need in Indian River County. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about special needs populations. And also very briefly about your assisted housing inventory here in Indian River County. And finally, and again briefly, talk just a little bit about sales prices. I think Gladys and Stan are going to talk about that in a lot more detail when their turn comes. So could I have the next slide, Stan? Thank you. One of the things that we do, one of our one of the major sources of information that we provide, and by the way, I manage the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse. That's something I wasn't doing 10 years ago. But about 6 years ago, we established the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse in cooperation with the Florida Housing Finance Corporation. We have a state contract with them. We're in our 6th year now. And some of the things that we were doing much more laboriously 10 years ago, we now have on our website. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, or y'all can certainly call me at the office if there are any further questions you may have, and you can certainly go to our website and find a lot of this information. At any rate, one of the major data sets we produce in the way of affordable housing need is our affordable housing needs assessment. We do that for all jurisdictions in the state of Florida. There are approximately 500 of them. And a major piece of that is estimates and projections of household characteristics. And those characteristics you'll see there on the slide. We start with population. Our population numbers come from the Bureau of Economic and Business Research. We translate those into households, and then we distribute those households over 5 different characteristics: tenure, income, cost burden, size, and age of household. Could I have the next slide? Yeah, thank you. And so, for example, in Indian River County, this is predominantly a single-family county in the way of tenure. Over 3/4 of the households in Indian River County, by our estimate in 2005, or about 43,000, were owners, and about 1/4, slightly less than 1/4, were renters. And as a result, your home ownership rate is higher than that of the state of Florida, and certainly higher than that of the U.S. Next slide. What do we mean by cost burden and affordability? When we think about that, there are really sort of 2 characteristics that we look at when we think about need. One is cost burden, and the other one is income. And when we talk about cost burden is probably the true need number, because what it reflects is the proportion of a household's income that they're devoting to housing costs. And you see a list of those costs in this slide. Primarily mortgage payments and utilities, or in the case of renters, rent and utilities. And next slide. This, as I said, this common measure of housing need is cost burden. We typically, when we talk about need, combine cost burden with income. Income is defined as a percentage of area median income. In Indian River County, that's estimated typically by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for metropolitan statistical areas and non-metro areas. What I typically use is, in this case, I'm using the 2006, could I have the next slide, Tim? Using the 2006 HUD estimated area median income for Indian River County, the Vero Beach metropolitan area. By the way, they adjust these numbers for household size, but again, the HUD estimated number in 2006 was about 55,500, and that would have been for a family of 4 persons. And what you see here are the typical categories of income that we talk about, and these are primarily programmatic categories. So, for example, moderate income households are those that have incomes between 80 and 120% of that estimated median. And these categories drop all the way down to extremely low income households. And those are households with incomes that are less than 30% of that area median income number. And finally, besides the sort of conventional categories of moderate, low, very low, and extremely low, we also look at another income category which is at 60% of adjusted median income. That's because that's a typical income for Florida Housing Finance Corporation properties, tax credit properties typically. And so that's a number that is also programmatically a very important one around the state. Could I have the next slide? When we talk about cost burden, we're typically talking about a threshold of 30%. That is, if a household is spending more than 30% of its gross income on housing costs, it's considered to be cost burden. There is another sort of typical or conventional benchmark, and that is a household spending more than 50% of its income on housing costs. Florida Housing typically uses 40% when they talk about housing need, and they want to talk about it in terms of cost burden. They typically talk about households spending more than 40%. And of course, the choice of these benchmarks or thresholds has a lot to do with the estimation and projection of need and your planning and policy making. Next slide, Steve. In Indian River County, I'm going to go through this, and there are several numbers in these next 3 or 4 slides, and what I'm going to try to do here is sort of give you a general idea about the size of the need in Indian River County, at least insofar as we estimate it, and then I'm going to temper that a little bit with how that need looks when we think about programmatic requirements, that is, the eligible incomes. And let me add here, I'm not aware of, maybe the two of y'all would know, but I'm not aware of any affordable housing program that typically talks about cost burden as a part of the eligibility requirement. Really, eligibility is driven exclusively by income. But when we talk about need, we typically combine income with cost burden. So, in fact, when we do that, we're really sort of taking a relatively conservative view of the need, because we're not looking at all households at a particular income level, although I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We're looking at all households at that income level who are cost burdened. Now, of course, as you might imagine, the lower we go in income categories, the higher the percentage of households in that category. For example, extremely low-income households, the majority of those households typically have cost burdens in excess of 30%. So in Indian River County, we estimate, this is in 2005, a little over a quarter of all households have a cost burden of 30%. That is, they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And that breaks down into about 9,500 owners and about 5,100 renters. Now, the percentages up there, in case of owners, 20% of all owner households and 40% of rental households, that's relatively typical for the state as a whole. And let me just also add here, when we, at the moment, when we produce these estimates, we are assuming that the distribution of these characteristics has remained the same since 2000, because we produce this distribution of household characteristics by holding the 2000 distributions constant over our projection horizon. Now, as everyone in this room knows, something has happened to prices in the last 5 to 6 years. And we are starting to look at new census information. American Community Survey, which is an annual survey very similar to the decennial census, asks many of the same questions and provides many of the same detail that the 2000 or the decennial long form does in the way of household and housing unit characteristics. And we have not begun to incorporate that information yet into our estimates and projections, but one of the things we're seeing, and there are some statistical issues involved in the extent to which we do that, but one of the things we're starting to see in the American Community Survey data is a marked increase in cost burden across the state. And so these numbers here, as I said, these numbers have remained, at least the percentage of households, remained fairly stable over the decade between 1990 and 2000. But they seem to be creeping up fairly rapidly if we're to believe what's going on as represented by the American Community Survey. So could I have the next slide? One of the benchmarks or thresholds used in the state, and it's used by the Department of Community, by the State Department of Community Affairs for the housing element as a sort of a safe harbor, is to estimate need. Local governments, for example, can look at all low-income, extremely or severely cost-burdened households. That is, households whose incomes would fall below 80% of area median and would have cost burdens greater than 50%. That can be a safe harbor. And in Indian River County, you see here that there are about 5,700 households that meet that definition. That's our estimate for 2005, and that's, as you see the breakout there, about 3,400 owners and about 2,300 renters. At least in terms of a percentage of their individual categories, about twice as many renters as there are owners. Next slide, Stan. If you want to look at households from the standpoint of, first of all, a typical program eligibility income, we'd be looking at, for example, SHIP program, typically I would say generally looks at households at or below 80% of area median. When you look at that, as a picture of affordable housing need, and you combine that with cost burdens greater than 30%, what you'll see here is that about 16% of the owner households, that is, we're now looking at 30% cost burden instead of 50% or more cost burden, substantially increases the number of households that we would estimate to be in need. And the same thing is true for renter households. In this case, rather than looking at 80, in these particular numbers on the slide, we're looking at 60% because, again, that's a typical income that's served by Florida Housing Finance Corporation rental projects. And so that's often a benchmark or a threshold. Slightly over 3,900 households, or about not quite a third of renter households in 2005. Could I have the next slide? Yeah. Projected growth. We're estimating that for severe, again, for this sort of convention or safe harbor definition of incomes below 80% of area median and severe cost burden is greater than 50%, we're estimating that there are going to be over 91 households in Indian River County in 2030. And you see the breakout there, approximately 5,700 owners and about 3,400 renters. That's a growth of about 3,400 households between 2005 and 2030. Next slide, Steve. As you see there, again, using 60% as your income cutoff, we're looking at 9,600 households. And if we look at 80%, obviously a larger proportion of the total households in the county, 1,400, or excuse me, this is income. If we look at the growth in income, that is the pure income eligibility issue, our projection is that Indian River County is going to, those households with incomes below 60% of AMI are going to grow about 9,600, and for households below 80%, we're projecting a growth of over 14,000 households. Next slide, Stan. Because we use a census to make these estimates and projections, one of the things that we typically say about those numbers is they tend to exclude certain special population groups, in particular farm workers and homeless persons. So to get a more comprehensive look at your affordable housing need in Indian River County, you really have to look at those needs assessment numbers in combination with farm workers and homeless in particular. Two other special population groups that we produce information on are the elderly. That's just sort of a typical output in our needs assessment, which are households by age, and also persons with disability. Next slide is just to quickly show you this information is available on our website. This is looking at households with at least one household member with a disability at a particular income and cost burden level. These are households with incomes below 60% of area median and severe cost burden. And you see here the proportion of that larger group of households contains a substantial number of households with at least one household member with a disability. Next slide. Just very quickly, some estimates and estimates about your assisted housing inventory. The Indian River County Public Housing Agency has 345 by our last, or looking at the source for this, which is U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They had 345 housing choice vouchers and a waiting list. This is based on a 2004 survey that we did of PHAs in the state, a waiting list effectively equivalent to the number of vouchers that the Housing Authority has to dispense. Next slide. Your inventory. You have about 2,900 assisted housing units. That is, units that have been assisted or financed in to some extent by 3 or 4 major sources of assistance. Federally, Housing and Urban Development and Rural Housing Services. Within the state, the Florida Housing Finance Corporation, and if you have, although I don't believe you do, if you have a local housing finance agency, they're typically another source for bond monies. And you see here, your inventory We don't have comparable information on a lot of the rural housing developments in the county, but your inventory is fairly young, and most of your properties have been built with some form of financing from the Florida Housing Finance Corporation, and that's typically tax credits. So there's an advantage to that. Not only are you not necessarily seeing the level of physical deterioration that will occur with any structure, of course, over time, but there's some issues regarding preservation that I want to touch on briefly. As you see here, about a quarter of the properties in Indian River County have some assistance from rural housing, and about 1/5 have some support from housing and development. Now, the reason why those percentages don't add up is because it's typically with an assisted housing property, you will layer various financing from various sources. An important consideration, not only in terms of the inventory as a whole, but in terms of serving a very difficult to serve population that's extremely low income households with incomes, as I said, less than 30% of AMI, which in Indian River County, if I recall, is about $18,000. Those households, because of the level of subsidy necessary to bring those rents down, commensurate with an affordable rent, one of the significant, and in this case, federal programs that helps with that are rental assistance contracts. And Stan, could you go back one slide? You'll see there that we estimate that there are about 460 units in your assisted housing inventory with these rental assistance contracts, which means that the households in those units are going to pay no more than 30% of their income for cost burden. And that is extremely significant because very few of these housing programs, and that's particularly true for the state housing programs, they do not serve these extremely low-income households well, at least in terms of cost burden. Next slide, Stan. Preservation. Preservation is becoming a more and more important issue in the state of Florida because particularly the rural housing and HUD properties are aging. Rental assistance contracts are expiring and are not being renewed. Mortgages are being terminated, or properties come to the end of their 20 or 30 year life in their mortgages. So preserving this affordable housing has become an issue in the state. Now, in a sense, the state of Florida is a little new to this because Florida is a relatively young state relative to a lot of older, say, East Coast states or communities that have been doing affordable housing for quite a long time. But Florida's properties, as I said, are starting to age, so you're seeing issues of physical deterioration, and contracts or the assistance itself is coming to an end. And what that means is that these properties are more at risk for opting out of the affordable housing inventory that is going market rate. So that's something that a lot of local governments are being paid, and certainly the state is paying a lot more attention to. As you see here in the slide, one of the advantages in terms of Indian River's inventory is that the properties are typically rather young. That is, they've been either they were funded or constructed within the last 15 years or so. And that the end of rent or income restrictions for the Florida Housing Finance Corporation assisted properties are fairly far off in the future. But as you see here, there are about 400 units of these 2,900 odd units in Indian River, which have some combination of the following. Either their HUD rental assistance contracts are going to expire in the next 5 to 6 years. In some cases, the only connection, or in a sense, the case where properties are most at risk in this situation is when mortgages are terminated, and the only thing that's keeping, in a sense, the property in the assisted housing inventory are these rental assistance contracts. And the contract periods have been getting shorter and shorter as the federal government pulls back in terms of funding. So what might have been 10 or 15 or 20-year contracts several years ago are now 1 to 5 year contracts, and these contracts then are constantly coming up. And once these contracts expire, of course, it puts the property, theoretically at least, more at risk of at least the potential of opting out. Now, typically what's been happening is that these rental assistance contracts are renewed. And What you will also normally see is that properties owned by nonprofits tend to renew to the maximum of the contract period, which is usually around 5 years, and for-profit companies often tend to renew for much shorter time periods. So the point here is that you need to keep an eye on properties as, for one reason or another, mortgages terminated or come to a close, or these rental assistance contracts expire. These are the point at which these properties become most vulnerable, and it is a time at which the local governments and the nonprofits and the affordable housing developers in the county need to pay close attention. Next slide. Just going to show you 3 slides on sale price. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because, as I said, I think Gladys and Stan are going to talk in more detail. What I want to show you here is just the last 5 to 6 years, the extraordinary decline in availability. And this slide, while unfortunately a little difficult to see, shows the distribution of sale prices in relationship to the median income. And what you're really seeing here, actually, let's go to the next slide because this is really too hard to see. This is at least we compile this information from the county property appraiser, and this is what we saw for single-family home sales in the year 2000 from the property appraiser data. And what's interesting about this, first of all, is it's multimodal, and there is a wide range of sale prices in the sort of bottom half of this scale. And this, by the way, runs from less than $50,000 all the way up to over $1 million. So what you saw in Indian River County in 2000 was, reasonable access. But in the year 2005, in the next slide, we're looking at a completely different housing market. In fact, this is so striking, you wonder, you sort of wonder what is, we know what's going on, but this is just so striking. And this is not atypical of what's going on in the state of Florida generally. So what you see here is a real dearth of opportunity below the median. We often, when we estimate affordable housing indices, we often typically use the median sale price as a part of that. And we often caution people who use these indices, Stan, if you could go back to the previous slide for just a second. We often caution them that when they use the median sale price, they're disguising a lot of what's going on in the market below that median. And what you see here in the year 2000 was exactly that. The median sale price, simply using the median sale price for constructing an affordable housing index, would have disguised a lot of the opportunities that existed in that whole structure of the market to the left of the median. But in the year 2005, this is a sort of classic clustering around the median. There is no story below the median. And what's also fascinating about this is that in the previous slide you saw, as I said, a very multimodal. There were a lot of peaks and a lot of price categories. In the 2005 slide, that's not true anymore. And as you can also imagine, the median has shifted. The median sale price has just about doubled in Indian River County since 2000. So, and that's the reason for this. So, next slide. Just real quick, rents. If you looked at 2006 fair market rent, which is a rent estimated by U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for Indian River County, the Vero Beach MSA, what you find is that two-bedroom apartment, according to HUD, now people typically roll their eyes when they see fair market rents because some people will often say we don't find apartments for $706 and two-bedroom apartments typically in Indian River County, but the hard fair market rent is a reasonably good surrogate for at least thinking about the sort of structure of the rental market. And what you see here is that a household to afford that apartment, not spend more than 30% of their income, would have to earn a little over $28,000. And that's a very low-income household in Indian River County, just very slightly over the 50% very low-income definition. Finally, to pay for that, if you just go back real quick, to pay for that apartment, your housing wage, which would be what you'd have to earn in order to spend, again, no more than 30% on that rent, you'd have to be making not quite $14 an hour. Final slide, just my contact information. Please call, and certainly please go to the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thanks. All right. So Bill's kind of giving you some information on where sale prices are and what income is. I'd like to just take a couple minutes to look and see what that means in the real world. Let's drift back 10 years to when Bill was here last time, 1996. I'm guessing your hair was a little darker? Yes, his hair was darker. And there was more of it. Okay. And the median income in Indian River County was $40,400. 70% of median, which is where a lot of these programs try to target some of the ownership, was $28,280. Sales price, your median sales price in 1996 was $84,000, and as you saw from Bill's data, there was a lot of variation in the sales prices. So someone making 70% of median could buy a house at $72,000. They could buy a house almost at $80,000 with zero subsidy. And really, your programs back then were aimed at helping people have the down payment and the closing costs that they needed. Because folks sometimes, at that end of the market, have trouble saving. All their money's kind of going toward living, have trouble saving. Your programs were designed, you probably offered, if Sasan's nearby, you probably offered $5,000 or $6,000 worth of subsidy back then. And that was enough to get people into houses. Now, median income's gone up to $55,000. So now we're looking at someone making 70%, around $38,000 a year. But your median sales price, let's just look at that for a minute. Your median sales price went up to $220,000. So now we've got someone that can qualify for an $80,000 mortgage that needs a $139,000 deferred loan. And let me change the interest rates are now around 6.5%. And so now with that, we've got someone that can qualify for about a $90,000 mortgage. Now, we just talked about as well that there is product, or Sasan has said, showed us the SHIP program, that the average amount, the average sales price they've been using is around $142,000 or $150,000. So there is still product, according to the people that are buying homes under the SHIP program. They're finding things in the $145,000, $150,000 range. So if okay. So now we're still talking about someone needing about $35,000 worth of subsidy in order to qualify for a house. Fix the insurance, okay. Someone's yelling back. All right, let's.
And do you have to pay the insurance a year in advance, and then? Yeah.
Right. So if we go insurance up to what it is, probably around 1.5%, or about $2,200 a year. Is that about right from the back? Okay. You want to make it 3? Anyway, as insurance is going up, you can see how sensitive this model is. We now went from $38,000 to $55,000 worth of subsidy needed. If interest rates tick up, also the amount of mortgage amount someone can qualify for as well. These are the issues that are forcing people in communities where prices are even higher than here to start looking at these community land trusts. Is there any questions from the okay. I'm assuming y'all will just jump in if you have questions. Okay.
No, Wesley will.
Yeah, I've got a quick question. So now, you're saying the average median income in Indian River County was 52.
55,000. Right.
And for these programs, 70%.
I just use that. We could change that to anything you want. But yeah, 70% of median sometimes is where people feel their ownership programs are targeted, not much lower than that.
And if they go to buy a $150,000 home, they need about $35,000 in subsidies?
Right. Right.
Okay.
And when we changed the insurance up to 1.5% from 0.5 like I had it, those folks would need about $55,000. So what's happening is you're hitting incomes that are slightly higher than that with your SHIP program now, because you're providing still around 30, I believe Sasan said 30,000. So you're hitting incomes higher than 70%, or people are finding houses less than 150,000. Okay. Okay, so community land trust. Traditionally, community land trusts started in areas that were getting pressure to gentrify. They were very grassrooty, traditionally, started by neighborhoods when they had areas that had been a low or middle income neighborhood for years, and communities started to gentrify. An example in Florida is Bahama Village in Key West. They have a community land trust. It was the traditional neighborhood where folks from the Bahamas came over when they settled. And the people there knew that as Key West prices were skyrocketing, they knew that this land was going to continue to skyrocket. There was going to be pressure to gentrify it and lose what they felt was the historic nature of their community. They therefore wanted sales prices to be restricted. They didn't want people to able to get market rate appreciation, and they wanted to be able to force whoever owned the house to have to sell it to someone who was income eligible.
Can I ask you a quick?
Certainly.
Now, the way I understand gentrification, that's basically a cycle of a neighborhood where you have single-family residential, then neighborhoods decline, then you have rentals, and then after a while it becomes a desirable area, the market jumps back in, they buy, and they turn it back into single-family residential in great locations, similar to what you right downtown Vero Beach almost.
Right, perfect. Exactly.
So now, how does that play in? I don't see how.
Because the folks who are selling basically feel that their kids will never be able to move back. The price of the housing will get so expensive that their friends, their neighbors, their kids, and grandkids won't be able to stay in that community because they won't be able to afford it. And so they want, often Delray Beach is an example of that, west of US 1. The neighborhood there has said, we want development without displacement. We want this always to be, this part of Delray Beach to a place where working people can always live. And the market is such there, they've already redeveloped east of US 1 with $500,000 and $600,000 condos. That neighborhood felt that if they don't start a community land trust, then their neighborhood will become $500,000 and $600,000 condos, meaning it will no longer be a place for working people. And the folks in that neighborhood decided they wanted it to stay as a place for working people.
Okay, as you were using the word gentrification, you didn't use gentrification, but you were using the root word of it.
Gentrify.
Gentrify.
Right.
Thank you. I understand what you're saying, but I don't see how the word gentrify or the process of gentrification happens in that scenario that you're trying to break the cycle of. Try your Key West example one more time.
Okay. All of Key West had become very expensive except for this one neighborhood, Bahama Village. The people who lived there and some of the community activists felt that if they didn't start a community land trust and restrict who could buy the houses and restrict the price of the houses at resale, that neighborhood also would be bought up by developers or individuals who would rehab the houses and who would have the prices go up like the rest of Key West. They're trying to mess with the market.
Okay.
Community land trusts are trying to mess with the market, trying to stop, as you said, that natural progression of things going up. These community land trusts traditionally have been designed to try and stop that, so that the neighborhood gets redeveloped, but the prices don't skyrocket.
Okay, thank you.
When you do a community land trust, and I apologize for being tardy today, but is that a voluntary thing by the people that own that property that want their grandkids to come back and stuff, or is that something that they decide to, that the government decides that's best for them?
Usually it's a nonprofit that does it, and so it's people have. Community land trusts tend to work when people have, the choices are rent or leave. And this really is a model, a type of tenure that's kind of halfway between rental and ownership. So they traditionally, if they want to live in that neighborhood and they can't afford a market rate house in that neighborhood or in that county, then their only choice is either continue to rent or buy in a community land trust. And understanding the market and whether or not people will be willing to do that is extremely important in making a decision to go forward with a community land trust. I would argue it works in the Keys because if you have to work for a living and want to live in Key West, your choices are a community land trust, give up some of your appreciation, or drive to Homestead. I do have to say that I look at Sarasota and I wonder, okay, are people going to be willing? Is Sarasota that desirable they'll be willing to give up a portion of their appreciation at resale, or they drive an extra 20 minutes to Hardy County? We're already in such a drive till you qualify kind of mentality that, will the market go, okay, Hardy County doesn't have a community land trust. I buy my house there and I can sell it for whatever the market will bear, or I go 30 minutes closer into Sarasota and I have to give up a portion of my appreciation. I don't know if the market's there for that.
So if they buy something in a community land trust, that's their choice.
Right.
So they know they're locked in up front.
Absolutely, and education up front is like one of the most important features of if you go forward with this model. One of our board members who was an attorney a legal services attorney feels very strongly that everyone should be represented by counsel. Every buyer should be represented by counsel and really thoroughly understand what they're getting themselves into.
Well, yeah, you know, when you get when you get into the market, and I'm curious because you go around this country, and if you go to New York City, for instance, there's a lot of transit in and out of the city. Workers in places like Sandestin, I see large amounts of traffic coming in the morning, probably 30 miles away.
Right.
But in a lot of places, also in the larger cities where it gets very expensive, and people they got to pay salaries that allow them to live and service in their community.
Right.
So I'm wondering if that's good or bad for getting employers to pay what they need to pay to have workers in their community.
Was that rhetorical, or were you?
No,
yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the challenge that we're facing, I'll kind of get to the mechanics of this in a second, but the challenges we're facing in Florida is that our economic demand for housing is coming from outside of the state. So you've got people who have made money somewhere else, who sold property for very expensive somewhere else. They're not having to work for a living and survive in Florida on what they make in Florida. And that leaves the people who are working here, in a position where they can't afford housing. I mean, I would argue that that's what's driving up our prices so much, is our economic demand coming from outside of the state.
Let me, Mr. Chairman, so now what you're talking about with the land trust, is that something that perhaps, is Habitat doing that now? Or is this a different animal? We don't have anything like this in New River County, to the best of my knowledge.
To the best of my knowledge, you don't either.
Okay.
Okay.
St. Francis Manor. Okay. So, okay.
Yeah. The way these tend to work is that the people who buy into a community land trust are buying the vertical improvements. They lease the land from a nonprofit for 99 years. In the ground lease states what the resale terms are. Generally, I'll walk through the example in a second. At resale, they will do an appraisal of the property, and the people who own it, the vertical improvements, get a certain percentage of the appreciation. The rest of it stays with the unit so that the unit is affordable to the next buyer. So in this example, if we have a $200,000 house, we got someone making $41,000 a year, which is around 74% of median. We've got a $200,000 house. The value of the improvements is $160,000. The value of land's $40,000. They're going to get, the land has to come into the deal somehow. Some local governments that are looking at these are donating land, some surplus land. Others are providing subsidy for the nonprofit to buy the land. The person needs about $50,000 in subsidy to buy the improvements. So we've got basically $88,000 worth of subsidy, the land going in here, and the $48,000 to buy the improvements. It's these kind of numbers that is now in Florida. What's very different about community land trust in Florida is they're not being neighborhood based. It's local governments going, my goodness, $88,000, and we're going to help one family for 7 to 10 years, and then they're going to sell, and then we'll get our subsidy back, but the prices will have gone up so much by then. Now what? You know, we're not going to be able to help another person with that $88,000. So this community land trust type movement in Florida is being driven by, mostly by local governments, more so than by neighborhoods.
Can I ask you a question? Yes. Have you ever seen this work, instead of it being by neighborhoods, do it by a parcel? And the reason why is, and I dare ask the question, what are these? What does Bahama Village look like compared to the rest of Key West?
You know, let's talk about another neighborhood. They've done some. They have not been as successful as you would hope they would be. The units that they own that they have rehabbed look very good. They have bought some units that they maybe shouldn't have and weren't able to rehab them, and those don't look so good. It's more of a function of the nonprofit not being perhaps as good as it should be than the model. If you look around the country at some of these other ones, Dudley Street in Boston, for instance, the housing stock's in very good shape. People are maintaining them, and
if we could use this concept and not do it in a neighborhood,
right?
Perhaps.
And that's what's happening in Florida. Sarasota's all scattered site. Lee County, you're all scattered site in Lee County. So yes,
and even make it so that perhaps the unit didn't have the in perpetuity portion to it, but actually if somebody sold that, you still use the same formula, but then somebody could, if they wanted to be a part of that program and qualified, they could, or just anybody could buy it, and we could take that money for a different unit in different place, so that we don't have the same house being owned by the same structure forever. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
Is that ever been done?
No, but that doesn't mean you can't do it.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't mean it wouldn't work. It's possible. I think some of the challenges, some of the future challenges would be, it's difficult, as y'all can imagine, to be elected officials and be asked to put $88,000 or $100,000 worth of subsidy into a unit to help one family. It's right. It's not. But if you were told, but this unit's going to be affordable forever, then it gets a little easier.
Or the $88,000 is always going to be there.
Right.
And that's.
But as we're seeing with prices going up like they are, the $88,000 is going to be half of what someone might need in 10 years. So then you're going to have a future board have to decide, okay, well, we got this money back, but $88,000 isn't enough. Now we're going to have to raise it to $160,000.
Right.
And so I think that's why local governments and elected officials are getting so interested in this land trust model. It's like, okay, we'll put in the big subsidy dollars, but we want it affordable forever.
Okay, let me jump in here.
Okay.
Maintenance of this, new roof, new plantings in the yard when they die,
Right.
whatever. Who pays for that?
Usually the owner.
And how do
Owner.
they come by that money?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. I mean, they're going to have the resources to maintain the house. It's halfway between ownership and rental. You own the house. You can paint the front door any color you want.
So
but
do you
yes,
help
when things
them
break.
put aside so much money for a roof that you know is going to have to be replaced within 15 years or whatever the type of roof they put on? How do you help them manage their money?
Well,
or-
they can. They do sometimes if they're hit the very extreme. If they're trying, the lower the income, usually the more hand-holding there is on the credit stuff and the budgeting information.
Then what if they have a job situation where maybe they don't stay in the same job as they anticipated, or whatever happens, their company folds or does something else, or then where are we?
Then, I mean, if they get a higher paying job, do they still get to live there, or if their income drops?
Or their job disappears?
Right,
and
just
they're
like
looking for
everyone
another.
else. I mean, they would need to sell or move or.
There would be conventional financing on this?
Right.
Not-
Fannie Mae.
Yeah.
Fannie Mae, right.
So
will
it
buy
would
the-
be a typical foreclosure process or something along those lines in the event that, unfortunately.
Right. Hopefully not. Hopefully the Community Land Trust nonprofit there, if it got to foreclosure, Fannie Mae has agreed that they will notify, and Fannie Mae buys these on the secondary market. Fannie Mae has said they will have their servicers notify the Community Land Trust. The Community Land Trust, for instance, Middle Keys Community Land Trust has a line of credit with the Florida Community Loan Fund. If somebody goes into foreclosure and they don't have a buyer ready, they will use their line of credit to buy it while they get the next buyer ready.
And then they just go through an eviction process then?
Right. Hopefully they don't get to that. Hopefully with a nonprofit in the middle, they won't get to that. But yes, technically that's what, if it got to that point. Now, the challenge is that what Fannie Mae refuses to do is allow the resale restrictions to survive foreclosure. So if the nonprofit doesn't get in there and buy it, then those resale restrictions go away and it becomes a market rate unit.
I mean, let me ask you, I'm not sure I completely understand the concept. Somebody owns the property, a nonprofit.
Correct.
And somebody comes in and buys a house at a certain price, which is generally below market.
Correct.
They live there for 10 years.
Right.
They want to sell it.
Okay.
How does that work when they go to sell it, and what kind of appreciation do they get?
Okay. The middle of this chart that I hope you can see, we've got the family, if the house prices went up 6.5% a year, they do an appraisal. The estimated value at the end of payoff would be about $370,000. Under this one model split here, which you can do at any split that you want, we've got 25% going to the owner and 75% going to the subsidy provider. What that means then is that under this option A, some community land trusts feel very strongly that their job is long-term affordability. So when someone sells their house, they only allow them to take a portion of the appreciation, none of their principal, none of the equity they have, and none of the down payment. In that case, we've got a house that originally sold for $160 because we took the land out of it. We need enough money to pay off the balance of the first mortgage, and we need to pay enough money to pay the seller their $29,000 worth of appreciation. So the next house could sell for as little as $118,000. We pulled the land out and we're giving them a sliver of the appreciation. What that does to folks is that they paid in principal and interest about $84,000. They're going to get $29,000 back. If we compare that to regular home ownership, it's really lousy. If we compare it to rental, it's better. So if someone rents and they move out, they get, I used to say they get security deposit back, but then some developers corrected me. No, you get nothing back when you move out. So
it's a little better than rental. Also, they get to deduct their taxes, and
if they pay enough, and if it's more than the standard deduction, exactly. They also have some of the non-financial. I'm guilty of looking too much at the financial side of these. There's some non-financial benefits of being a homeowner. You don't have to worry about your kids getting moved to another school because the house gets flipped to a condo and you have to move. You've got some stability. The legislature fixed the insurance problem, so insurance isn't going to go up anymore. Right? We got insurance, but in all seriousness, you got property taxes that are only going to tick up 3% a year. You've got your principal and interest payment should be flat because these are all fixed rate mortgages. So really, you've got some hedge against inflation there. The other, what local governments and people who really believe that in long-term affordability like about it is we've got under this option someone making 41 grand a year, about 75% of median. If incomes go up at 2% a year, someone making 75% of median will be at about $50,000. They can buy this house with no extra subsidy. So that if the house would have cost potentially would have appraised at $370,000, they're going to be able to buy it for $118,000.
But really, home ownership is a lot more than a house payment. I mean, you have to have money if your dishwasher goes out.
Exactly.
If you're plumbing, there's always something.
Right.
And so to misunderstand that you can just slot into this and that renting sometimes you can just walk away and get you a better rental.
Exactly. And people can borrow money against the equity they have. And I would argue that the first family, if someone's going to stay in it only about 10 or 12 years, the first family would be all right, right? Because most things don't break in those first 10 or 12 years. But family number 2 and 3. And Burlington, Vermont, for instance, is one of the granddaddies of community land trust. They have started I think they call it a rescue fund, but they've got a fund that they've capitalized to do the repairs afterwards.
Yeah, you'd have to have
and this model, this appraisal-based model, rather, is supposed to take into account that if someone has deferred maintenance, the appraisal will be less. So there's supposedly an economic incentive built in here, just like we all have, to maintain the house at sale so they'll get more money.
Now, when you said they can borrow against the equity.
Right.
But you said when they sell, they don't get any of the equity.
Right, they borrow against their share.
They're $29,000.
They're $29,000. Okay. Now, on the other example that is also out there is where people are able to get, which I tend to think is a little bit more fair, they'll get the equity that they put into the house and their down payment. So in this example, we would have the price would be higher because we need to recoup $140,000 to pay off their share of the appreciation and the equity in the house, but they would get $52,000 at sale instead of the $29,000. But of course, what that does for the next buyer is makes it need a little bit of subsidy, because anytime we allow the seller to keep more of the appreciation, we have to have a higher price. When we have a higher price, it's a little bit less affordable for the next buyer.
Yeah, I kind of like, just philosophizing here, I kind of like that a little bit better because it seems like you don't create a cycle of dependency or a wheel for a hamster that they can't get off of. And you're giving them the opportunity, if they've been there for a certain period of time, they can get their equity back out of, and they can actually perhaps move into a non-subsidized home.
Potentially, right. And you also, I use 25-75 because that's what a lot of these tend to use. We can make this anything we wanted. And there's one community land trust in Florida north of Tampa, a smaller community, but they have said that if you stay there 20 years, you get 50%. Because if you stay there 20 years, we don't want you to, we think that's long enough. You should be able to get more. So it requires the price in 20 years to be sold more. They're probably going to have to find some additional subsidy for buyer number 2, but the person gets more equity. Okay. It's anytime if you increase the amount of money someone gets at sale, you decrease the affordability of the next buyer, and it's just a kind of question of a philosophy of where you stand on: is housing about building wealth? Should our housing programs be about long-term affordability, or should they be somewhere? Should we try and find a strike somewhere in the middle, a balance somewhere in the middle?
How long does it take for someone to get on a list and buy one of these houses whenever they come available?
The thing about these community land trusts is it's been around for 30 years, but there's hardly been any units built in it. There's like 3,000 units nationwide. So it depends. In Aspen, Colorado, it's, you get into a lottery, and it takes forever to get into their community land trust house, because if you're not a millionaire, you're in a community land trust house. Otherwise, it's a function of how much subsidy is available, how much land they have, and how fast they can build the units.
I could ask the question, why so few nationwide? I mean, are we looking at something that in reality doesn't work, therefore it doesn't? I mean, when you say if the program works and if it is successful, then it would be indicative of the number of units you would think that it would be available or that are in play nationwide.
Right.
And I don't mean to ask that as a rhetorical question.
Oh, okay. They work in areas where housing costs are so high, the majority of working people have the only choice of leave or rent. And there just aren't that many communities around the country that have gotten to that point.
But
It's on a robust market. It's really where there's no other choice but to do it. And in some areas, it happens around a university or a hospital where there's blighted conditions, and the hospital or university will step in and they want their employees to live nearby, and so they'll have a pretty strong hand in getting that created.
Okay.
But we're asking the market to give up a lot. We're asking them to give up that traditional bundle of rights they have, which is I can sell my house for what any fool will pay me for it. We're asking them to give that up. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not, I think part of the reason these aren't as popular around the country is that markets aren't responding to them. They're responding to them when there aren't other choices. They're responding to them where they don't, Delray Beach, if you're making $20,000 or $30,000 a year, you're not going to have many options anywhere in Palm Beach County. And if you've got an attraction to that neighborhood, you grew up there, you want to raise your kids there, you might be willing to give up a portion of your appreciation to be able to buy in that community. But, we're just such a drive to qualify. I think when people have choices, they don't like community land trust.
Okay.
Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah, do you want to find my presentation?
I would love to find your presentation.
Okay. It should be on there, but why don't you just see? Anyway, I'm going to talk about inclusionary zoning, if you're finished with land trust concept. The inclusionary zoning is basically a land use type regulation that where you require that a certain percentage of the units in a market rate development be affordable. And this, again, isn't something that's happening a lot in Florida. There's quite a few instances of it around the country, but there are very few in Florida. I'm going to go through some of the things that, that's the wrong one. Yeah. It says final. CLT. It says inclusionary and...
CLT presentation final.
Yeah.
That's very good.
That's not it. Use my stick. Anyway, several communities in Florida have looked at them. The Tallahassee, Leon County has one. Martin County's looking at one. Other than that, there haven't been any adopted by law. Last week, Collier County adopted inclusionary zoning through their comprehensive plan, where they required in their housing goals that 15% of all development on an annual basis will be affordable. And they haven't worked out the regulatory parts of that yet. How you doing? Is that the stick? That's not my stick. Oh, okay. Anyway. Well, I want to have my language up there. Yeah, but you have to go further up, too. You want me to change places? Yeah. That's all yours. Okay. I think there's a new handout that went around also with this inclusionary housing. Okay, the main thing with an inclusionary ordinance... Yeah, you want to try it? is that you have to establish a nexus with your findings and purpose so that it's legally defensible, because otherwise you're going to end up with a taking, because you're requiring developers to build something, and you have to show the public purpose. And so that's why these studies that are being done, for example, by the Schimberg Center are so important, because you need to show that the public good is actually being harmed by the lack of affordable housing, and that it's whatever the harm is, you need to establish that very clearly. And this is a way to have the private sector provide your affordable housing rather than the public sector. Right now, the county is probably doing almost all of the affordable housing in your county, but once you start having inclusionary zoning, then you're expecting the private sector to provide those units. So part of the decision-making process in doing this is you need to figure out what your threshold number of units will be that will trigger the inclusionary requirement. In Tallahassee, it's quite high. It's around 50 units, over 50 units. In Martin County, they're using development over 10 units because they have a lot of smaller projects going in. And then you have to identify what percent of those units will be affordable. Usually it's around 10 or 12%. And again, you need to do the math to figure out what your rationale is to come up with that percentage of units. Usually it's based on some type of analysis of what percentage of your population is cost burdened. And then you would decide what your targeted income group is for the affordable units. If you're requiring higher end developments to develop say single-family home ownership within their development, then you're probably talking about a target income group that can afford home ownership. So it won't work for people that are extremely low income. You would need to use a different strategy for that. And then you would look at the types of units that would be used for inclusionary, whether it be the multifamily portion of a planned unit development that has single-family development, whether you're going to have accessory units be allowed to be the inclusionary units, but you can use it on single-family or multifamily. But it's really, really important to provide some type of incentive to keep the developer whole, because you just can't make people build units in a certain fashion without keeping them whole. And the best way to do that is certainly through density. But you also need in your ordinance to have some type of an appeal process, because sometimes a developer could show that there's no connection between their development and the creation of a need for affordable housing. And if you don't have an appeal process, the ordinance could be struck down. There was one that was challenged in California because there was no appeal process. Now, as I said, this is not something that's done in an antagonistic manner. You want to work with the development community with plenty of incentives, and some of the types of incentives that work financially are density, density by right, ensuring that the development can make use of the full density that is allowed in that land use category. Things like expedited permitting and administrative relief help a development to keep their costs down. And then you can also include your financial assistance that you already have with your affordable housing programs. Your affordable housing program can work with the developers. For example, not all developers want to build affordable housing, and so if you have affordable housing developers, you could let them work with the market rate developer to build the units. A lot of inclusionary ordinances have a payment in lieu option, so that if you don't want to build the units on site or off site, you can just make a payment. And we don't advocate those because, well, we're not advocating this either. We're just telling you the information about it. But we think that the payment in lieu is basically a backdoor impact fee, and that if you don't establish your inclusionary ordinance like an impact fee ordinance, that it would be legally challenged. Also, the fee that you could charge would never amount to the cost of actually creating a unit, and so what you're doing is basically belittling the whole purpose of the inclusionary ordinance by taking in a smaller fee that doesn't really get you a whole unit. And of course, partnerships are important with the local government and flexibility. Now, one of the main components of inclusionary zoning is how long the units have to be affordable. And when Stan was talking about community land trusts, those are affordable in perpetuity. With the inclusionary ordinance, you would want to think about how long you would want that to last. Now, if you're going to combine an inclusionary ordinance with the community land trust, then those units that are produced by the private sector would automatically go into the land trust, and that's how you would maintain affordability. When is inclusionary policy the right policy? You have to have a really robust real estate market. If your market is kind of slow, it just won't work. It really needs to happen where there's a lot of activity. Certainly the large-scale developments could make use of this if you have a good working relationship, and the traditional developments, the new urbanism developments. Okay. I guess Stan covered some of these items about, the benefit to the public sector of having these types of innovative methods. You can avoid a windfall to the families if they sell out because of the escalating prices, and you would be creating a permanent stock of affordable housing. Most of the housing that you've subsidized could go at any day back into market rate housing. Okay, any questions on inclusionary zoning? I'll talk about linkage fees, which are even more exciting.
Just we just approved a
Multifamily development.
multifamily where there were 9 units or something like that.
44, I think it is. 42 or 44?
No, the low cost.
Yes,
But how many units were low cost?
44, if I'm not mistaken, Joe.
I don't think it was that many.
This is 34.
34.
Yes.
Is that the one on 74th that we're talking
And
about?
State Road 60. Yes.
No, I'm back on State Road 60, 16th Street.
Yeah.
There were 34 affordable units in
Yeah.
there?
8 units we gave them 8 units, or some of us gave them 8 units to the acre. And it was, so, yeah, that's right, 7. Thank you very much. 7 units to the acre, and it was a 20-acre parcel, or 20.
Okay, my question is, though, is when they're affordable when they move in and when they sell them, I don't recall, where did that money go? Is it just affordable for the first buyer?
Yeah, for,
I think there was a limitation on the price for a certain number of years, and after so many years, the price could escalate to allow them to recover some of the equity. The exact details I don't remember
Yeah.
at the time.
Okay.
So this was voluntary, and they received density in exchange for providing affordable units.
Right.
Yeah, that's what this is all about. The land trust and the inclusionary ordinance, they help you to keep them in the affordable stock because you've got a little bit more control over the eventual resale of the unit. But many of the units that you're subsidizing now, the people can sell and pay back your subsidy, and then that's the end of it.
Yeah, yeah, they do get a break because they get an interest-free loan, basically. But when they sell, they reap the profit, and that money that they pay us back, and that money goes back in to help someone else.
Right. And that's what Stan was saying, that the money you get back in today's market isn't enough to subsidize another unit. So it keeps whittling down the power of your dollar.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I'm sitting here thinking about this, and, there's advantage to that over renting, but as Commissioner Bowden said, there's, when you look at that and you see what your return would be over a long period of time, say several years, there may be an advantage to renting, and particularly subsidized rental units where rent is very reasonable compared to the market. So it's I'll listen to it.
Yeah, homeownership isn't for everyone. The linkage fee is actually a type of impact or mitigation fee, and these are quite rare. It's based on the premise that a development will create the need for additional employees, and that those employees will require housing. And again, with this, you have to establish some type of connection between that development and its creation of new employees that will need housing. And you can use linkage fees on commercial and residential construction, or charge them on commercial or residential, just like an impact fee. The same way with the inclusionary, you would establish a threshold size of what size of development would, or unit or square footage would pay. And then you would do a study to determine the amount of fee based on the square footage of the development. And since you're going to be taking money in, you would establish a trust fund and guidelines to guide the program. Now, in establishing this connection between the development and the need for housing, you go through this process. And I'm going to describe the process that Collier County just went through over the last year and a half. They haven't gotten the bill for the studies yet, but I think it was around $50,000. And they had Dr. Nicholas from University of Florida, and then a very good law firm from Tallahassee to do the linkage fee study and write the ordinance. And just last week, which is why I have new slides, I just got all this last night, they decided to table the whole program. And what I want to go through with you is the exercise that county went through. They have a lot of things in common with your county, so that you can really see what it would mean if you were doing it here and just make a decision. So you analyze the housing costs in the area. Then you look.
When you say they table the program, the county?
The county commissioners
Did not go
voted
forward.
to just put it away on the shelf and for a long time.
Okay.
After they looked at it. You look at the wages in your area, all of the things the Schimber Center does for you, and then you do a calculation of the workforce needed that's created by the development, and you calculate a fee differently between residential and commercial construction. Now, in residential construction, like if you were going to charge this fee on home building, okay, the way you look at it is that each house creates an operations and maintenance employee or employment of people that it takes to operate a house. And that includes the construction, the financial, professional, business, and maintenance of the home. And you calculate the earnings of those households who you would consider to be your maintenance employees. And then you calculate another calculation of the critical employees that are needed to maintain a house, and that's your police, firemen, and teachers. Now, in non-residential construction, such as government buildings or retail, commercial, institutional, industrial, that's where the way you look at it is the employees per square foot. And you translate those employees to households, because not every worker lives by themselves. So you come up with this employee household factor, and then you look at the upper income limits that household earns. And then you figure out the gap between that industry and the what the people earn. And then you are able to create a gap per square foot of that type of development. So, in Collier County, if we're talking about houses, there's 188,000 houses, and the studies that they did showed that there's 0.092 employees per unit, or 17,000 of these operation and maintenance employees. When you weight the employees per household, you come up with 1.42 operation and maintenance employees per household. And that household would have an earnings of $65,000 and could afford a house of $225,000. But the only houses that are available in that community cost $262,000. So they would need $36,000 assistance. Now the assistance needed is a key part of the rationale of doing a linkage. Then you look at the employees by the size of the dwelling. And what Dr. Nicholas showed was that smaller houses have fewer employee needs, and it's only when you get over 2,000 square feet that you start needing more employees. And that full-time residences use more employees rather than seasonal residences. And they did a regression analysis that showed that a large house, a 5,000 square foot house, would create an operation and maintenance employee assistance need of $5,800. And then you have to add to that the fire, and police, and teacher, the critical employees. And you come up, the way you get their numbers is you look at their actual assistance needed by their salary, and you end up with a 5,000 square foot house would require an impact fee, a linkage fee of $9,422 for both of those types of employees. Now, which is $1.88 a square foot. A 2,000 square foot house is 82 cents a square foot. And when I'm saying this, you're thinking, from the look on your face, well, we could never charge that because it would it'd ruin the economy, and we can't do that. And I pretty much agree with you. This calculation is actually showing what the public or private cost is of construction to the affordable housing need. If you flip the argument, well, if the private sector isn't going to pay it, and somebody is going to pay it, how much is it? This is how much it costs by not building affordable housing.
You know, you have to ask yourself whether you're subsidizing the person that needs the affordable house or the people that can afford to pay salaries so people can live in those affordable houses.
Right.
Who are you subsidizing, the rich or the poor?
Right. Both. Well, yeah. Now, that's for residential development. It gets even more interesting with your non-residential development. Here, you're looking at this gap by land use, and if you, they do it by employees per 1,000 square feet of a new development. And the categories are government, industrial, institutional, office, retail, and tourist being your hotels. Now, the gap in the income of those employees is weighed against the cost of building their housing. So the calculation was that for government type construction, that it'd be a $32 a square foot impact fee or linkage fee for affordable housing. And moving on down, industrial would be $35 a square foot. The institutional type development surprisingly is lower because they have higher income employees. The office cost would be $35 a square foot, and retail $48, and tourist facilities $43 a square foot linkage fee. These are very large gaps, and that's because it's all based on wages versus the cost of housing. And the wages are so low in relation to housing costs that if you were going to actually address those housing needs, that is what you would be paying, either through the private sector paying or the public sector paying, or not paying it by not doing it, which is pretty much what we're doing. But this example assumes that the private sector would pay that full cost of the gap. And Collier County decided that they weren't going to tinker with it and say, well, let's just have a tenth of it and get something in here. They just said, that's the whole enchilada, and we're not doing it. But I just think it's interesting to consider these numbers because they were scientifically done, and they do show, I mean, Dr. Nicholas is one of the top economists in the state, and this is what they calculated this cost is. So just to summarize the linkage fee ordinance, you would establish these types of findings. You would figure out what types of fees you would impose, have your trust fund, consider how you're going to administer it, and then you'd probably exempt things like affordable housing projects. And then if you'd have to have an alternative fee calculation if you couldn't show any nexus. So that's the linkage fee, sorry.
Wow.
Does that conclude?
Yes, Dan's going to talk about
Open
another.
it up to the public?
We need to take a break.
Yeah, we could.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
You want me to?
Yeah. Any further questions or comments from anyone on the commission?
I don't think I like the linkage fee.
You don't like that?
You don't like what?
I don't think I like the linkage fee.
No. If not, we're going to need to take a break in 8 minutes, so we'll go ahead and take a break now. Come back in 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the public for questions. And okay, take a 10-minute break. Yeah. Oh, we got 2 more presentations? Okay, I thought they were through.
Well,
Okay, well, we'll take the break
start.
now and come back in 10 minutes to do
I
the...
need some coffee.
Meeting back to order, please. We had a request to ask some questions before we went on, but we got I understand, about 5 minutes left in the presentation. So if you'll bear with us about another 5 or 6 minutes, we'll finish up the presentations, and then we'll open it up to questions from the public. So are you going to?
Okay, right. I can just talk briefly about employer-assisted housing. Sorry, turn my microphone on. There. Okay. Sorry about that. I can talk briefly about employer-assisted housing. Traditionally, when you think of that, you think of company towns. When people opened mines in the early 20th century, there weren't any housing around. They were in the middle of nowhere. Employers would build the houses. They usually they didn't often treat their employees very well. Those pretty much disappeared by the 1920s. In 1980, the employer-assisted housing idea started to come back at the University of Pennsylvania. They were in a horrible neighborhood. The area around Penn was just rapidly had deteriorated, high crime, lots of drugs, just a bad place to be. Penn was supposedly faced with the idea of potentially moving after being in the same spot for 200 years. They also had the problem of, that's an Ivy League school, charging Ivy League prices. And when people brought their kids to go check out Penn, they drove through one of the worst neighborhoods in Philadelphia. So they needed to try and help clean up that area. They began offering their professors guarantees, loan guarantees. And this was 1980, so people still had to put 20% down on a house. But if the loan was guaranteed, they could get 0% down. So Penn guaranteed the loans and encouraged their professors, especially their newer professors, to start moving into that neighborhood. And it is now one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Philadelphia. So they used that to try and revitalize the area around the school. Chicago has a very well-publicized employer-assisted housing program, but if you Google employer-assisted housing, you'll get hits on Chicago as the first things that come up. So it's very well-publicized, very popular. They did 70 units last year, so it's a very small, and most of their employers, 9 different employers made loans, but over 80% of the loans were from 2 different employers. University of Chicago Hospital, large employer. Chicago School District, large employer. Their assistance amount, they're capped at $7,500, so we're talking about small amounts. And most of the folks were earned right at the median. Chicago is also a market that doesn't have the huge difference between what people make and how much houses cost. So overall, it is large employers working to to offer a benefit that other employers they're competing with aren't offering, and it is a recruitment and a retention tool for them. Most of the programs are structured. People have to stay at least 5 years, or they have to repay their assistants. Sometimes it's longer. The University of Miami has a program for its professors, for its faculty. It's 50% of the cost of the house, up to a maximum of $300,000. The president of the University of Miami decided there was a benefit to having her professors live near the university. The university's in Coral Gables. Coral Gables is expensive. So they're offering up to 50% of the cost of the house. The maximum house price someone could buy is $600,000. When they sell the house, whatever percent of the house they got in subsidy, they pay that back in addition to the amount they borrowed. So someone borrowed $300,000 for a $600,000 house, and the house went up to $1 million, just so I can do the math in my head, then they would pay back the $300,000 plus 50% of the depreciation, or they pay back $300,000 plus 550, so $550,000, and then the University of Miami then feels that that's enough they can use to help the next employee buy another house. So it's similar to this community land trust, except instead of keeping the unit permanently affordable, they're saying, well, we know if prices went up that much, we know that we're going to need more than $300,000, so we're going to instead then offer, what we'll get paid back will be closer to what the next employee will need.
I like that better than all of them so far.
And you can certainly structure the Pasco County and Largo have their concern recently has been flipping. Their prices went up rapidly like everyone else's, and they were seeing people buy a house with assistance, flip it in 3 years, pay back the county, and still have a big chunk of money. And the county didn't think that was fair, that they were making that much money off the county's investment. So they call it an anti-flipping program, but within the first 5 years if someone sells, they owe all their subsidy back plus a certain percentage of depreciation. It starts at like 80% and then goes down 20% a year till the end. And you certainly can do that by not keeping the units affordable. What it means is you have to recognize and keep looking at the prices and the community and looking at the income and saying, okay, It's been 10 years, and now we need, or 5 years, prices have gone up, incomes haven't. Instead of offering 30, now we need to offer 50. But as you know, you're getting more back. So as long as you're willing to raise the subsidy as needed, it can be a way to have money coming back into your SHIP funds.
And it keeps the same unit from being eternally affordable.
Right.
But allows for another unit, the termination of a unit.
Right, and as you can imagine, I have a spreadsheet that your staff can use to calculate at what percentage and what increase, how much money would come back into the county.
But you were really talking employee-driven.
That one's employee-driven, but there's no reason that the local government as
Which
well
one
with
did
its
you say
SHIP
you
program.
liked?
I like that, but I'm not for the county, but perhaps maybe as a land trust to administer, and let them.
Well, I think it's kind of like, too, when you give the subsidy, you become their partner. And as a partner, you share in the profit.
Right.
So it makes, to me, it's more equitable.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I can wrap up on, I can be finished with employer-assisted housing, and I think Greg had a...
Let me just click on that for me. Good afternoon, Greg Vide with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. Very happy to be here today. I love coming up to Vero Beach and Indian River County. I'm going to step back a little bit because we've been throwing the terms affordable housing and workforce housing around today. So I always, as a planner, I always like to come back to first principles just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. I've entitled my talk today, Attainable Workforce Housing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a toolkit that the Regional Planning Council is going to be releasing. And so my remarks are going to be about that. Next slide, please, Bill. So I'm just going to go over briefly workforce housing, the workforce housing problem. We've talked a little bit about that today. And then I'm going to get into the solutions that we think from a regional perspective certainly merit further consideration and study by us here and by local governments in the region. Next slide, please. So one of the key issues to kind of understand here is that when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about housing for which monthly rents and or mortgage payments do not exceed 30% of a household's income. So that's sort of the universally accepted notion of what an affordable housing product is. And affordable housing delivery is normally concerned with the very low and low income populations, those making generally less than 60% of area median income. And these are the households that often qualify for federal assistance and have the highest need, as Bill mentioned earlier in his remarks. Next slide, please. But when we're talking about workforce housing, we're talking about a different type of thing. And what we're talking about is we're still talking about affordable housing that's affordable within that 30% definition. But we're talking about housing for really the moderate income workers in our communities. And one of the best definitions that we've seen developed is by the Urban Land Institute. And they say that workforce housing is housing for moderate income families with at least one full-time worker. And what does that mean in terms of incomes? Well, that means in terms of incomes, housing that's affordable to households earning between 60 and 120% of the local area median income. Next slide, please. So the bottom of your screen there for Indian River County, the group that we're talking about here is that group households making roughly between $33,300 and about $66,000. So that's the income range we're talking about. So I just wanted to clarify that. Next slide, please. Okay. Go ahead. The workforce housing problem. Well, I think Stan and Gladys and Bill talked about it very well, and I'm not here to give you folks numbers because that's not my role specifically today. But essentially, what it boils down to, in a nutshell, is that wages are really not high enough, are not moving in line with housing prices. I mean, that's really the crux of the problem here. So what you see is that from our perspective regionally, the housing issue really needs to be looked at as an issue of economic development, or in other words, partnered with the issue of economic development. So next slide, please. And this is a very simplistic illustration of what we're talking about here is that somewhere around 2001, we saw a very predominant spike in housing prices. The housing prices that are shown on that slide there is the line in blue. line in red are incomes which have tended to be a little flatter over time. So that's as you see, as that moves further into the future, then that gap widens. Next slide, please. And what you see in the next slide here is the issue of an affordability gap for different wage earners in your community. Of course, the needs or the subsidy, however you want to put it, are increasingly are increasing for the lower wage earners on the left-hand side of the graph there, to a little bit less so for the higher wage earners. Still, all though making incomes within that workforce housing category. So we still need to look at the issue of subsidy for these folks. Next slide, please. Well, housing is connected to the economy, and it's connected to the economy. If you hit that slide again, please. What we see here is that a strong and diverse housing infrastructure really helps to attract and retain businesses, and it really helps to attract and retain workers who are working in those businesses, and it increases spending in the community. So we're really talking about a cycle here, and that's an important point I need to stress, because when we're talking about housing, it's not just a social equity issue. I mean, that may have been so in the 40s and 50s when the federal government became a landowner and promulgated the affordable housing programs. More so now, really, housing should be viewed, in our perspective, from a regional perspective, as an infrastructure item, as an item of economic development. That's something that needs to be put forward at a community level. Next slide, please. Two economic developers in the region said it as well as anyone, that workforce housing is an important economic issue. Ted Asolfi, the outgoing president or the executive director of the Martin County Business Development Board, basically summed it up by saying, if you don't have workforce housing, you don't have a workforce. And increasingly so, in our discussions with human resource professionals and those people that are trying to recruit workers to the businesses, they're indicating to us that the lag times or the times to fill those vacancies are increasing. So you're finding your employers having a harder time to fill those vacancies and positions. And so there is definitely a connection, because if those folks cannot find housing, as Dan said, it's a drive to qualify. Next slide, please. Certainly a robust housing market provides a lot of economic incentive. Housing market provided the state. This is a headline taken from the front page of the Stewart News in 2005, and it was just evidence to show that a robust housing market made the state $2 billion in, I believe it was the dock stamp revenues. So it is a certain. It certainly does generate a sizable amount of economic impact. Next slide, please. This is an older study, but Lee County looked at the costs of not providing affordable housing to their community, and the study was called "The Public Cost of Inadequate Affordable Housing." And what they found is that not providing affordable housing to the workers in the community certainly leads to lost economic opportunity to the tune of somewhere around $240 million a year. Next slide, please. State of New Hampshire developed a report called Housing New Hampshire's Workforce, and they estimated that the tight housing market for their workers cost the state somewhere between 1,300 and 2,800 fewer jobs, and $57 to $121 million in personal income that's not received, and a reduction in gross state product of between $123 to $253 million. So there is a definite connection between housing and the economy. New Hampshire is certainly on the forefront of this issue. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now, I'm going to transition to, and the folks that preceded me said it better than I did, but I'm going to talk as a planner. I'm going to talk about some policy implications that you might want to consider if you are going to think about developing attainable housing programs in your community. And I'll be happy to get into a little bit more detail, but I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'll try to be fairly brief. Housing markets are inherently complicated. There's no debate about that, I think, amongst people in this room. And the question is, what intervention should a local government play, and what intervention should the private sector play? The really important point that I want to stress here is that there is no single solution to the crisis or the problem of attainable housing. And really the issue is that communities really need to embrace an array of possible approaches. And central to that issue is the notion that the private sector has a definite role to play, and the public sector has a role to play. And so what you really need to think about is, again, what is the appropriate role for the public sector to play in partnership with the private sector? And context matters in this deliberative process. Solutions for a rapidly growing community, I think we touched upon that earlier, are going to be different from those in established communities. So you're not necessarily going to employ an inclusionary housing ordinance in Indian River County, where you may think about that in a St. Lucie County. Again, it's a different context, different demographic that's going on there. Next slide, please. Again, effective workforce housing programs are really an outcome of a vigorous public-private debate that goes on that really has reached some consensus on mutual beneficial approaches. Again, there's something that's going to be a give back to the private sector, and there's going to be a give back to the public sector. And really the key here is that the programs are coherent and integrated with existing policies. There's no point in adopting policies and programs that are in contravention to a local government's comprehensive plan and to established policies that are on the books right now. So we're not talking about wholesale changes to existing policies. And manageable. I mean, this is a key here. We've been looking at this issue for a number of years now, and we've had some discussions with a lot of the planning staff and a lot of the folks that might be on the front end of the implementation of some of these programs. The key is these programs, whatever they are, have to be manageable, and that's really a key. And again, it's important to consider an array of approaches. The last point there is that these policies really need to be transparent, and that simply means that they should be easily understood by the public sector and by the general public. There shouldn't be any mystery as to what's going on here. We talked about it with the community land trust model and the importance of education as that piece there. Next slide, please. So what the Regional Planning Council did to look at this issue of workforce housing from a regional perspective, we did a number of things. One is we developed a white paper that introduced the whole topic of workforce housing. We had a workforce housing summit at the end of 2005 that was very well received, and it introduced some of these potential solutions that Stan and Gladys and Bill touched upon. And then the third element of that piece is that there's a binder at the end of the desk there called the Workforce Housing Toolkit, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in my remarks. Next slide, please. So what our toolkit tries to get to is some of the leading policies and programs that can be used to preserve and promote workforce housing. And it's really intended to serve as a resource document and to guide workforce housing policy creation. Obviously, these things are voluntary. We're not expecting local governments to adopt any or all of these. We're just merely trying to provide some good information to the elected officials and policymakers. Next slide, please. What we've looked at is, in coming up with the toolkit, we've divided it into 4 sections because we really want people to look at workforce housing in a number of different dimensions. The one dimension we talked about here is sort of the issue of housing development. We need to put more supply on the ground to meet the need that's there, the existing need, and then the projected need, as Bill was talking about. But the other issue is the issue of housing preservation. We know anecdotally a lot of stories about condo conversions and mobile home parks being converted and the loss of rental units. So there is an appreciation for housing preservation as a policy that needs to be looked at. Finally, you need to look at some financial tools and resources that you can avail yourselves of to help push this issue forward. Next slide, please, Bill. Thank you. So what we've done in the toolkit is we have every policy that we talk about. There's 14 different policies and programs. Is introduced with a description. The benefits of that program is described, and the key policy issues are highlighted. And that's really important because, again, the issue is, as I mentioned, I'm going to use how implementable is that policy. And that gets to the crux of the issue in our minds, is that, do you have the staff? Do you have the resources? Do people understand what it means to implement these policies and to communicate them in an effective manner? Next slide, please. So if we step back to the issue of developing housing or developing housing units on the ground, there are a number of different approaches, and these by no stretch are all the array of solutions to look at housing development. These are just kind of a select sample, but certainly around the country people are looking at the issue of accessory dwelling units. They're looking at the issue of expedited permitting. The idea there is that attainable housing should be given a little bit more impetus at the local level, so it can rise to a review process that allows it to be expedited. Inclusionary zoning, we talked about that today. Infill housing development for an older community. A lot of the example now is to develop in Delray, for example, develop housing on infill lots, so that we're not developing in the western reaches or the greenfield areas of those communities. And special area plans, those take a large area and develop a plan for the build out of that area. The towns, villages, and countryside that the Regional Planning Council has worked on which recently has been approved by St. Lucie County, has mandated an 8% workforce housing inclusionary zoning requirement. So every development that's coming out there must set aside 8% in terms of workforce housing. Next slide, please. In terms of housing preservation, some key tools to look at are adaptive reuse, and this gets to the notion that there are older buildings, commercial, industrial buildings that have kind of outlived their useful life in terms of those previous uses, and they could be rehabbed or readapted for housing. Community land trust, we spent a lot of time talking about that. It's another way of getting at the issue of housing preservation. Next slide, please. Now, under financial tools and resources, and a couple of these things are going to be important as each local government kind of thinks about what they need to do. Donation of public land. I mean, certainly we've talked a little bit about that today with the passage of House Bill 1363 last year in the legislature. Every local government is going to have to take an inventory of their available public lands and to look at which of those lands might be appropriate for the construction of affordable housing. So this is something that's going to come back to local governments. Down payment assistance. This gets to the notion that the homeowner could get into a housing unit with a little help from the private or public sector. Employer-assisted housing, we've talked a little bit about that. Housing trust fund is an issue where it's getting a little bit more play in local governments, and the idea there is that if you can create a housing trust fund which is well funded by both the private and public sectors, you can start to buy down the cost of housing either through pre-development costs or development costs. And this is an important tool, I think, that more and more people are looking at, which really bridges the gap between the public and private sector. Linkage fees we've talked about. Next slide, please. Go ahead. So what we've done at the end of the day in the toolkit, we talk about each of these policies, and we provide some further detail and some information for review. We cite examples where they're used, and we hope that this document can be a living, breathing tool that is currently going to be updated and evolving as time goes on. A number of communities across the region have embraced some of these ideas that we've talked about. Certainly, community land trust. Certainly, the idea of inclusionary zoning and some of the other policies that we've talked about. So, again, the point I want to leave with you folks today is that you need to look at an array of approaches, really bring the private sector into that discussion, because they can provide, and I think they're willing to provide a lot of the impetus to push this issue forward. And I think if you hit the next slide, Bill, go ahead to the next slide. There's my contact information, and I'll be very happy to address any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission? Okay, we'll open this up to the public for any questions or comments that you may have. And I think if we can start over here first, if you come to the podium, please, and give us your name and your address.
Turn up the lights.
I don't know how long you're going to allow to talk, but I wanted to tell you, I thought this was a wonderful
Your name and
start.
address,
I'm
please.
Geraldine White. I live at 363 West Key Lime Square Southwest. My husband was the implementer, chairperson of this task force, and there are some others here. They were all volunteers. I saw Mr. Stark, Andy Bowler, let me see, our Reverend Carol Trax left, and I was very proud of the work that they all did, and I wanted you to know that. I wanted to approach you because I came here about 3 years ago. There are 3 of you that are still on the board, and there are some that are new, but I want to present what I talked about then. I want to show you 744,000 homeless in our country today. 800 homeless on any given night in our own county, and this was just in the newspaper. I showed you this of the many, many builders that were in our community in Vero Beach when I arrived 3 years ago, and I thought, this is outrageous that so many contractors and construction companies would be here building at one time. And I was told that they were all going to be working together to make things work together. And I, at that time, questioned it, and I ended up being correct. And I just wanted to give my comments. My husband and I moved to Vero Beach approximately 3 years ago, just prior to the last major hurricane. We had been vacationing here during the Dodgers spring training for 10 years, and when it was time to retire, we settled here. The climate and the Dodgers were a big draw. When looking for a house, it was difficult to find one. There were not very many available in the market at that time. When we ended up begging to purchase a model home so that we did not have to wait 2 years for a new one to be built. The hurricane had just passed, and the damage was horrific. In many areas, it was totally destroyed. So we didn't have any picture of what it was really like in Vero Beach when we came here, because it was just not really Vero Beach, and we hadn't been here for over a year, so that it was nothing what we had seen nor what we expected. So when once the debris was removed and signs of normalcy emerged, I thought, and I really said this, oh my God, I thought, and I told you that. I thought, what is going on? I ran here and I told you how many contractors are building at one time. It seemed like every street we went down, there was land being dug up. The trees that were not destroyed by the hurricane were knocked down indiscriminately by bulldozers. The animals that lived underground were killed as the concrete was poured everywhere. I really was shocked, and when I attended the first county commission meeting, after observing all of this, I asked, what is happening to our environment? Because it is our environment. It is no longer what the hurricane did, but it's what man was doing, and there really wasn't any difference. I asked the commissioners, and I didn't really get any answers because there really weren't any at that time. But I asked, as I saw more and more houses going up, well, where are the jobs going to come from? And where I am living, why aren't there any sidewalks? I try to ride my bike, I can't go very far, and I'm saying to myself, how can contractors come in and put up all of these homes and there's no place to walk or to feel safe when you're out on the streets? And so I didn't get any answers, and I wondered about the schools. I did question, well, how are we going to know how many children are going to be needed in certain areas? How is this being projected? And there wasn't any real answers. And as you see, that is changing as we go along. And I also asked about affordable housing units at that time. And again, there were no answers. It wasn't until a group of us met here. We came in one day, and the commissioners were having a meeting, and many of us thought it was a meeting that the public was invited to, and when we showed up, we found out we weren't. So you all, you probably weren't there. I see you going like this, but in any event, it was with a meeting of other commissioners and others in other surrounding towns were meeting, but it wasn't for us to be at. So you all moved to another room, and we sat there, and then a couple of people went in, and they told Mr. Lawther while we were there, because he was chairperson at the time, and he came in and met with us, and that's how the task force was initiated. He appointed some individuals to look into doing that, and that's when it started. So that was really good. And I know that we have difficulty with affordable housing, but it's also the workforce housing. And if some of you saw in the paper last week, some individuals on the school board were saying, well, maybe we should go to the homes of retired teachers and have them lease out part of their homes. I mean, we don't have answers, and yet we come up with statements that make us look foolish. At least to me. You don't ask a professional to come into your town and not be able to tell them where they might live and find something to be proud of and a draw to our community. The task force spent 18 months gathering and putting this report together, and then when they wanted to present it to the commissioners, it was during the time of elections, and they really only had about 20 minutes to present it. That's why I'm so glad you're looking into it now, and that you got started as soon as you were able to settle down. Now the market is in a slump, but I don't know why this wasn't predictable with not having enough jobs. And now we are left with vacant, unsightly sites with many decomposed animals living beneath, and homeowners are continuing to pay high taxes. We're seeing layoffs now rising, and now we're starting to get answers from you, so I can't put down there are no answers forthcoming. Some of the contractors have reduced their overpriced homes and now placed them in the affordable housing category. I can't argue this point, but I do know that approximately a third of the total income for any family should not be above that. So as a taxpayer, I stand here to ask my county commissioners, not the contractors, what are we going to do to plan? And when are we going to see something initiated so that some of us won't worry about the homeless sleeping out in weather like this? We need to address the needs of the approximate 800 right now in our own county who on any given night sleep in the cars and in woods and in places, any place else they can find. And we all know of their plight. They cannot speak for themselves, and every place I go and I see the homeless living in parks, it's all over the country. They're invisible to people. People don't want to recognize that they really exist. You know, they don't exist, is how we look at it. Now, I found out last week, and maybe you know, that $72,000 of FEMA's money that was a matching grant for us is no longer going to be available because of the criteria they use. We no longer fit into that, And that money was used to help with utilities and rent. So we are thinking, those of who discuss this, what's going to happen? Are these people now also going to be added to the homeless numbers? Because we found out that there isn't anyone else forthcoming to fill in that amount. We know Habitat is doing an incredible, fantastic job throughout the entire country. I don't know what this country would do if we didn't have the most wonderful volunteers working in not only that area, but in every single area that we need assistance in. Lastly, since my arrival, I have spent a great amount of time in Gifford on a variety of projects. And as I went through 2 years ago, I see cypress greens and many, many of the other homes that were destroyed by Katrina still tarped. Where are these former tenants? They were the ones that would meet beyond the affordable list for affordable housing. They would be on that poverty level. And I'm wondering, where have they gone? Where are those who have abandoned their homes due to the inability to maintain the upkeep? Our church sends over groups whenever they can to try to help the homeowners do some repairs there. Again, it's not enough. We just can't keep up with it. And if you go down any side street in Gifford, you are going to see so many homes abandoned and tarped. You say, well, why can't we fix these up and have more affordable housing? And hopefully that'll be something that you can look into, because there is a lot of homes out there. And I just ask you to take the time to look at that. And I'm also wondering, why are all the county and industrial complexes locating to Gifford in large numbers? It wasn't like that when I moved here. Maybe it was in the works. But on 43rd Avenue, you're moving right totally into Gifford. And if we're talking about gentrification, that's what I see happening there. All along the way, you're going to see signs posted allowing the homeowners and property owners to know that there are buyers out there wanting their property. Well, the buyers are out there, but what are they going to pay them? They have amounts that they're willing to pay, but you know well and good they get to pay this little amount. And just as someone spoke about, then up goes the big, homes that these people can't afford. Where do they go? Where do they go? It's the black community. I've seen it happen over and over again, because my husband, Eddie, has been in this housing field for over 3 decades, and I have been to more meetings and sat with more tenant organizations than I can tell you. So I'm not just speaking irrationally. I'm speaking from so many years of having participated. So when I was going around doing voter registration and some of the other things working in Gifford with the NAACP, I talked to many of the residents, and I told them when I had the opportunity that I would come before the commissioners, and I would tell them that you are really concerned about what's happening, about you seeing all these other buildings coming in your neighborhoods and not knowing when it's going to stop. What is happening? Are you going to be living there? Is this going to be a community in a few years? So I told them I'd ask you, and maybe you'll come up with an answer for me. I pray that you do. I say that because in every black community, even when I went to Harlem a couple of years ago, you should see what happened there. That was a total black community. Nobody wanted to get in there. Now you should see what's happening. It is not, and it's high-priced. So I'm telling you what happens. And then we move our jails into those areas. Every community I go into, in every black community, that's where the prison is. So I do request answers to these questions. I I don't want to see the people that I talk to you about remaining invisible to any of you, to any of us. And I always thank God that there, but by the grace of God, go I. And I truly mean that, so I try very hard to focus. And lastly, this is what the people in Miami are living. It's an experiment and a protest in a shanty town for the homeless. All the homeless have gathered together and are helping each other. This is the only place they have to live, helping each other in the United States of America, the home of the free, and where we all are supposed to have the best dreams. Thank you so much, and thank you for this meeting, and I just pray to God that you will just continue to build on it. I do think that you will, because if you had the foresight to have an in-depth meeting like this, I know it was for a good reason, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. White. We have one other presentation on the Coalition for Obtainable Homes. Who's doing that? From here.
Good afternoon. My name is Jim Goldsmith. I am the president of the Coalition for Attainable Homes. The purpose was to identify the housing needs and strategies appropriate for Indian River County. And recently we prepared a nearly 60-page report and presented our findings and recommendations to the Board of County Commissioners on October 10th, 2006. And this workshop is a result of that presentation. There's copies out in the foyer. When the coalition was formed in January of '06, its sole purpose was to create, support, and advocate for attainable housing. The board of directors of the coalition is a diverse group of individuals with experience raising from law enforcement to banking to real estate. On the screen, you'll see a list of the officers, followed by the directors. I now invite the members of the Coalition for Attainable Homes who are present to please stand. We do thank you for your participation and your sacrifice. Because of the many groups that are here today, I would like to briefly acknowledge those that provided valuable input as the task force report and presentation were prepared. We appreciate all of your input. As you can see, we benefited from the same experience and expertise offered to all of us earlier this afternoon. The task force spent many hours researching the strategies best suited for Indian River County. While no one strategy represents a magic solution to the housing crisis, the options represent a menu of possible strategies. We believe that the strategies, when used together, offer a synergy, which constitutes a viable approach for the county to pursue. We're glad you've had this opportunity to hear the range of strategies already presented here today. As you can see, we presented very similar recommendations back in October of '06. At this time, we would like to move through the 11 recommendations, accompanied by examples of areas in Florida where these strategies have been successfully implemented. We look forward to moving beyond the need data, which we all know is staggering, and we're asking you to take action today that will result in a measurable improvement for citizens in our county who are in desperate need of attainable housing. We feel strongly that the county must take a more proactive role in addressing these needs, and we as a coalition are prepared to assist in any way possible. At this time, I'd like to introduce Connie Popple, who is the Vice President and the Community Development Manager for SunTrust Bank, South Florida. She was a member of the task force and now serves as a coalition board member. She is also the chair of Indian River County's Lender Consortium.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Commissioners, for allowing us to do the wrap-up of this workshop. Some of these 11 strategies, you've heard many of them already today. What we've done is try to break them down, give definitions, and make the definitions simplistic. We know that this is not a simple challenge. It's complex, and the strategies are complex as well. But we've tried to break these down into understandable language so that we can all get a grasp of this challenge. Our first recommendation is to invest in a triannual study of housing needs. Clearly, the county has to manage a professional evaluation of the local housing needs to determine the supply, demand, and the resulting gap in attainable housing. Without access to updated, reliable data, the ability to make informed decisions about strategies is limited. A properly done study would allow the county, local developers, and nonprofit organizations, such as the Coalition, to pinpoint specific strategies to fill the housing gaps. Furthermore, a professional study would provide the means to properly evaluate the effectiveness of the comprehensive plans and local housing assistance plan. In 2002, St. Johns County commissioned an affordable housing study that determined that by 2015, over 200,000 additional affordable housing units would be needed in that county. The study contained several recommendations, including an affordable housing incentive plan and removing or reducing government regulations. The changes can be measured in the creation of projects such as the Floridian, which when completed will feature units sold at approximately $150,000 as compared to market rate of $250,000. That's substantial. Our second recommendation is to develop housing goals and review them annually. A report should be presented to citizens annually in a public meeting. The county also should reestablish the County Affordable Housing Advisory Committee to monitor performance against the comprehensive plan, as well as the local housing assistance plan. Currently, the only county committee charged with addressing the housing need is the Lenders Consortium, which is specifically focused on state housing initiative funds, better known as SHIP. The Coalition is happy to serve as the county's housing advisory group. The original Affordable Housing Advisory Committee was sunsetted on November 4, 2003. At that time, the committee had not met in over 18 months. The original intent was to review the established policies, procedures, and ordinances and recommend revisions to land development regulations and prepare the Affordable Housing Incentive Plan of Indian River County. The staff recommended sunsetting the committee because the review and recommendations were considered complete and there was no further activity for the committee at that time. In Lee County, they currently have a committee of 11 members appointed by the Board of County Commissioners. Its purpose is to identify relevant issues and problems relating to affordable housing in Lee County and provide recommendations to the Board of County Commissioners to increase the supply of housing. Our third recommendation is to encourage greater regional cooperation. And we were pleased to recently learn that Indian River County has joined a home consortium with St. Lucie and Martin counties. We are hopeful that this will be the first of many productive collaborations with neighboring counties facing the same housing challenges. We recommend that the Board of County Commissioners invite the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, you've heard Greg today, to partner with the county and the Coalition for Attainable Homes to act on the strategies being presented. Just over a year ago, the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council initiate a highly successful workforce housing symposium that brought together housing professionals and interested citizens from around the region in addressing the housing crisis. The Treasure Coast Homeless Services Council, whose executive director and president are coalition directors, addresses homelessness on a regional basis as well. In cooperation with mothers of infants striving for success in the city of Port St. Lucie, they were successful in securing a $1.23 million grant from the Hurricane Housing Recovery Funds to build affordable rental units for low-income working women and their children. Our fourth recommendation, and you heard a lot about that here today, is the Community Land Trust. The task force proposes that the county support the formation of a land trust entity which would acquire land on which to build attainable housing. As covered earlier, the primary advantage of a land trust is that the buyer only purchases the home, so the price is significantly reduced. There was a lot of conversation about community land trust. There's pros, there's cons about community land trust. The great thing about a community land trust is that it can be designed at the county's will. It is a way to start. The American dream is home ownership. I heard the term, drive till you qualify. So, and then I heard people talking about, well, maybe it'd be better if they rent. Well, maybe they could drive as far as they could go till they could afford a rental. But you can do rentals with community land trust as well. St. Francis Manor is a community land trust rental. So, and there are a number of community land trusts popping up all over the state of Florida. Delray has, or Palm Beach County, I know, has two. Key West, that you heard, has one as well. Orlando, Orange County has one. There's several. Martin County is working on one. So there's several in the making. So it is one option. We're talking, you've heard a lot of strategies here today. I'm talking about 11. Our presenters talked about even more. So there's a lot of strategies. No one strategy will work for every county. And we think that Indian River County is unique, and you know, the ones of us that live here believe that. But out of the strategies that we've heard today, several of them can certainly work in our county. In 2006, the Florida legislature passed House Bill 1363, a housing bill focused on addressing some of the affordable housing challenges the state currently faces. Among other things, the bill requires local governments to prepare an inventory, and you heard that before today as well, a list of surplus land that can be used for development of affordable housing. We are optimistic that this inventory will result in land to be placed in a community land trust. There's a land trust in Winter Park. Winter Park is very similar to our own Indian River County. It is Hannibal Square. I happen to have with me the floor plans and the renderings of those homes. They are gorgeous. SunTrust was the lead bank in doing the financing for those properties. So if you have any additional questions, and you have the experts on community land trust, but if you have any additional questions, I can tell you about our experience with Hannibal Square. Our fifth recommendation is to create a housing trust fund. Often a proposed housing development simply cannot achieve financial viability without some form of gap financing, which a housing trust fund offers in the form of low-interest loans or grants. As you know, the county already administers a housing trust fund solely for SHIP funds, but at less than $1 million a year and restricted to first-time homebuyers, it's not nearly enough. The Sarasota Board of County Commissioners created a fund to subsidize affordable housing efforts using $20 million from the sale of tax-delinquent lots in Northport. The funds can be used to purchase developed or undeveloped land, provide impact fee assistance, down payment assistance, home rehabilitation financing, and housing for disabled and other special need populations. Our sixth recommendation is to create a community development corporation. A community development corporation is a nonprofit group accountable to local residents that engages in a wide range of physical, economic, and human development activities. CDCs rebuild their communities through housing, commercial, job development, and other activities. A CDC's mission is normally focused on serving the local needs of low to moderate income households. A CDC is capable of applying for available housing subsidies for developers or future homeowners and determining the eligibility of prospective occupancy. Areas of all sizes, from Miami Beach to Leesburg, have community development corporations focusing on redevelopment in their targeted areas. Even the Leesburg CDC, serving the vicinity of Leesburg with a population of just over 19,000, has built 26 new homes with plans for 15 more. The coalition is eager to serve this role as we partner with the county and local citizens to implement the strategies discussed here today. The coalition is in the process of creating a community housing development organization termed CHODO, which will be eligible to apply for special reservations of funds. Now, at this time, to tell you about the remaining 5 strategies, I would like to introduce Richard Stark. Richard is chairman of the Treasure Coast Homeless Services Council, and he serves on the coalition board of directors. He is a well-known community philanthropist, actively involved in supporting the work of the Treasure Coast Homeless Services Council, the Riverside Theater, the Cultural Council, the Vero Beach Museum of Art, and numerous other civic, social, and cultural endeavors in our community. With that, Richard Stark.
Thank you, Connie. Good afternoon. I'm Dick Stark. I've been in this community for some 30 years, and I'm proud to have been a member of the task force on affordable housing, along with Eddie White, whose leadership was key to the success of that program, and I'm glad that Jerry was here today. I want to congratulate the county on holding this workshop today, because it is a very constructive step in addressing the problems that are very serious for our community and for our country. As an aside, since I am the chairman of the Treasure Coast Homeless Services Council, I really am compelled to point out that there is a direct relationship between the cost of housing and homelessness. By addressing affordable housing, we lessen the pressure that causes homelessness. Now, following up on Connie's presentation, our 7th recommendation is to pass inclusionary zoning. Now, I was going to say a lot about that, but Ms. Schneider certainly covered that, and I don't think I'll belabor the issue any further. I would point out that in Florida we have been a little bit slow to address this strategy, but a number of local governments, including Martin County, are considering and studying this strategy, and the City of Key West Community Housing Committee has presented a series of recommendations to their City Commission that include the suggestion that any commercial or residential development project require a community housing component. Our 8th recommendation is to alter zoning regulations. We commend the county for laying the foundations necessary to try to stimulate the production of affordable housing. The local housing assistance plan includes several incentives, such as 20% density bonus, small lot subdivisions, and accessory single-family dwelling units. However, we suggest that measuring the effectiveness of these strategies with the help of our coalition and of local residents may be necessary to determine how the incentives can be better communicated to developers or modified to increase their utility. Generally speaking, density bonuses make housing financially feasible and serve as an incentive to developers to build attainable housing. In Old Bonita Springs, the City Council is considering a developer's request for 50 additional units to his property in exchange for a contribution of $750,000 to the city's Housing Trust Fund. Indian River County might consider, just as Martin County has done, contracting with the Florida Housing Coalition, which is represented here today. Martin is undergoing a comprehensive review of their land use regulations and housing policies to determine how they affect the creation of attainable housing. Our 9th recommendation is to support new construction techniques. New construction technologies are allowing developers to build and therefore to sell homes at a lower price. We encourage the county to review the current building codes regulations with input from our coalition and area developers to ensure that expedited use of new code compliant construction technologies can be implemented. For example, several companies now manufacture homes that can withstand the winds of over 180 miles an hour. Other benefits include security, energy efficiency, and reduced maintenance. Homes are being made at a factory in less than a month and are brought to the site 95% complete. Actual home installation can sometimes be completed in just one day on the site. Our 10th recommendation is to index impact fees starting at $0. The county has noted that SHIP funds cover the cost of impact fees for affordable housing. However, the use of these funds is limited and insufficient to cover the number of attainable units needed in our county. The county currently indexes impact fees, but deeper indexing must take place to accommodate the needs of our county. In this scenario, the scale should start with $0 based on the size of the home. The county should also consider deferring impact fees until a attainable home is resold or refinanced. Martin County has been doing this for some 6 years. For families receiving SHIP funds that cover impact fees, Indian River County could consider simply deferring the fees until the time of the closing, so that when a developer like Habitat, for example, makes an application for a permit, it doesn't have to come up with the funds sometimes burdensome to get started. Our final recommendation is to consider the impact of the urban service boundary. By bringing up this topic, we do not claim to be experts on the issue or desire to take sides. However, we must point out that artificial barriers such as these may have unintended consequences that may not fully have been explored thus far, such as increased home prices and accompanying increased insurance premiums, property taxes, and utility assessments. With the urban service boundary in place, builders have an economic incentive to construct an expensive house on a large parcel in order to maximize profit. Given the boundary that is currently in place, we must be especially diligent about reviewing its impact on our ability to address housing needs. In conclusion, we realize, as Greg Viday pointed out, that there is no single magical solution, and many solutions have been brought up at this meeting. But we think that the 11 recommendations that we have made represent a synergy which constitutes a viable approach. As a community, we need to recognize the magnitude of the affordable housing problem and make a genuine commitment to effecting lasting solution. That calls for an expanded and more proactive role for the county. Frankly, not very much is going to happen without the leadership and support and to some extent the funds of the county. We note that the county's comprehensive plan has pages of goals and objectives relating to housing. As a practical matter, in the past, the county has generally relied on the initiative of the private sector to meet our housing needs. But according to the county's own 2001 housing report, the private sector has not been motivated to build affordable housing because there is much more economic return in building market rate housing, and that situation continues today. The county must establish a framework which is conducive to development of attainable housing, much of which might well be assumed by the private sector. Please don't misunderstand the thrust of our comments. We do not intend to be critical of the past. Our county's approach to affordable housing has been very similar to that of most other Florida counties and indeed throughout the USA. However, many other counties and states are now taking a new look at the situation and are beginning to take more proactive approaches. We welcome this workshop as the opportunity for our county to take a new look and see what can be done going forward. We look forward to moving beyond the analysis to the initiating changes in our approach to creating attainable homes. We look forward to action that will produce measurable improvement for citizens in our county, and we are in desperate need of affordable, attainable housing. We see a need, incidentally, for more than one workshop. I'm sure you do too. There will need to be more workshops on specific proposals to see what directions those should take. As you all know, there is a lot of discussion about controlled or managed growth in our community and throughout Florida and elsewhere. I've heard it said that affordable housing increases density and is therefore inconsistent with controlled or managed growth. But I submit that as a enlightened view, the controlled growth should take into consideration the needs of the community and should include affordable housing as a component of any plan. Our Coalition on Attainable Homes looks forward to working with the county and the experts that have been represented here today and our local citizens to ask the important question as to what action, all of our actions are being taken, what implications they will have on affordable housing. The bottom line is, when you consider all of the very fine presentations that have been made here today, there can be little doubt that now is the time for our county to take important steps to address affordable housing in our county. We thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission? If not, if anyone would like to speak, we'll start over here. If you'd come up and give your name and address.
My name is Peter Foster, and I'm from a company called Beach Cove Properties in Sebastian, 99th Street in Sebastian. Beach Cove is a company whose goal has been to create affordable homes for people to live in. And Beach Cove is a land lease community. It's 32 acres in size. It has space for 134 homes. It's a community where homeowners purchase their home. It gives the homeowners the ability to have pride in non-subsidized ownership in their homes and retain the appreciation in those homes. The homes, let me back up a little bit and say the homes sell for between $79,000 and $100,000 for a 1,200 to 1,600 square foot home. These are brand new custom built homes. They're factory built homes. It's a beautiful little community, and it also has the advantages for the homeowner of not only being low in price, but also not having to pay real estate taxes on those homes. So it's incredibly affordable for workforce, for our workforce community and for teachers and so forth. It's a community where these homes are all, again, I said that they're custom-built homes. They have plastered walls. They're custom built with the carpeting of choice for the homeowner. They're built to Wind Zone 3 standards, so they're incredibly strong homes. And we're a community that has been working very hard to provide this to the community, and it's been very difficult for us as a small developer to do this because of things like impact fees. With a house that we sell for $79,000, the impact fees that have been assessed for us are $10,000 per home. So as you can see, that's something that can be passed on when you're building a much more expensive home, but in our business where we're trying to provide those low-cost homes, it's very difficult. And the permitting it's taken 3 years of permitting for us to continue this kind of development. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm trying to just ask that also be looked at as another alternative to land trust as a choice for providing homes.
A couple of questions.
Yes.
You mentioned it's a land lease?
Yes.
So you lease the property that the home sits on?
That's correct.
Is this in the city of Vero or the city of Sebastian?
No, it's privately owned. It's in Sebastian.
How's it zoned currently?
It's zoned as a manufactured housing community.
Okay.
It's an older community that it was purchased, and all new homes are starting to be put throughout the community. So it's still moving. It's still being changed and modified and so forth over time. So.
I thought didn't we do the rezoning? This was the old lamplighter, right? If I'm not
Correct. That's
mistaken.
correct.
Okay, and that was RMH 8, and you came in before us for a rezoning, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it's not rezoning. We came in to ask for certain density, and then the density was reduced further, and then we came back again, and the density was reduced further.
Yes.
So
that's what it was.
Correct.
Okay. I thought I remember it coming before us for a density change or something.
Yeah. But it might be looked at as potentially another solution for affordable homes for people. And they can sell their homes to other people. We do criminal and credit background checks on everybody that enters the community. The monthly fee that homeowners pay to the community is $295 a month. And that covers all their real estate taxes. It handles all of the lawn maintenance for the maintenance staff, everything. Twice weekly trash removal. So it's a very affordable solution for.
Well, it's a I don't know what you call it now because the new manufactured homes are much better, but I mean it's a mobile home park.
Well, no, it's not. And these are not. These are.
I know they're not mobile homes, but
correct.
I mean, it's a manufactured home park.
Correct.
In other words, you lease the property.
That's correct.
And what type of rent controls do you have on that over a period of time?
There are no rent controls because unless, for example, there's some way that we can be guaranteed the taxes won't increase for us, then it's difficult for us because we have to pass on our costs as they increase. So.
And you mentioned appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going after your product, but just what I've seen, generally these don't appreciate, they depreciate.
No, that's not true. Not for the newer homes. The newer homes that are coming out of the factories are incredibly strong. They're
I know they're well built.
Products.
I've been in them. They're nice. They plaster walls and things aren't stapled together like they were. I mean but what I've seen them where they've come up for resales. Some of the nicer ones, and the ones I've seen have depreciated, though, instead of appreciated.
That hasn't been the case in our community at all.
Okay, thank you.
I think sometimes that's a function of how well the community is maintained and so forth.
That's probably true, too.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Anyone else over here would like to be heard? Yes, ma'am.
I am Mary Lou Gutierrez, the housing manager for USDA Single Family Housing Section. This is one of our 6 counties. We're based in Okeechobee. And first of all, I'd like to really commend the SHIP staff. Actually, now that it's out of funds, our loans are not being used. So it's really very important that the SHIP funding be increased if there's anything that the Board of Commissioners can do. The workshop is very laudable because all the 6 counties that we go to now are also discussing affordable housing options. I have a question for Community Land Trust. Is because the agency also can finance leasehold under both programs, the direct loan, which is subsidized interest rate, and a longer term of 33 years, as well as the guaranteed loan, which is for moderate income, 60% of median. So is the nonprofit able to actually provide servicing for a first mortgage holder? For instance, if the homeowner borrower is delinquent, can the nonprofit be able to pay the delinquency, and if the homeowner does not pay back, transfer that home, the lease, to another qualified lessee? We've had this similar thing but it's guaranteed by the state of Hawaii, So that's the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and it's very effective for our programs.
Generally, the nonprofit wouldn't have the resources to do that, the guarantee. On the servicing side, yes, usually the community land trust, when notified from the servicer that they are in, someone's in default, they immediately take action to either try and figure out how to make them get out of default or work a way to get a deed in lieu of, and so that the family can move on and sell it to another. But in terms of having resources to bail out USDA and foreclosure, no. There's no, usually don't have recourse loans.
And I think that's where I would address this to the Board of Commissioners, at least the county, if there is a mechanism to be able to guarantee, this setup so that the mortgage or the bank or the lender, like even the federal government, can be covered. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else in this area? If not, anyone in the center like to be heard? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Wilsius. I live at 675 Cypress Boulevard in Vero Beach. I'm a professor of economics at Indian River Community College, and so I have some questions about the presentations that were given this morning, or this afternoon, excuse me. I'd like, if they can, to pull up a slide, first of all, that says, from Greg's presentation, that says the problem, housing prices rise faster than income, if that's possible. We had a slide that showed income going up and housing prices going up even further, but I doubt anybody on this county commission would argue with me that that top line in 2006 went the other direction. That's one of the ways that this county commission can address affordable housing. We have seen landlords get crunched in between rising insurance prices and rising tax rates, and those costs, unfortunately, as a landlord, I have to tell you, in many cases are passed on to renters. And if you want to have affordable housing, although most of the people that talked here today talked about home ownership, rental property at an affordable rate is one of the main means of affordable housing. And part of this is that it's easy during a period of a real estate bubble where real estate prices are going up and up and up for the property appraiser's office to find comps and say your values of your properties have went up and up and up. But here in this county at this point, what are we looking at? We're looking at property values in many cases where people have reduced the price of their houses as much as 20%, and yet there's no buyers. And so when the property appraiser's office starts reevaluating property values this spring for next fall's assessment, they're going to have a hard time finding comps, because if you put up properties at auction and nobody is there to buy them, then no sale takes place and there is no comp to say that the price has been reduced. So that top line is going down, and the landlords do not have the 3% cap that homesteaded properties have, and they have seen their property values go up significantly. And this year, frankly, they need to see those property values reflect the current real estate market. If that is passed on to the landlords, they in turn will be in a situation where they can afford to be in a situation where they don't have to raise the rents for their tenants. So that's one thing that's in your control, and something the county commission can do on their own is simply to direct the property appraiser's office to take extra steps to make sure that the current values are reflected. I'd also like to address the idea that higher densities necessarily make housing cheaper. As an economist, I can tell you that the boom that we had in 2004 and 2005 was perpetuated in a very big way not by people that wanted to move to this county, but by speculators. When I moved here this summer, the first time I came down, I looked at 20 houses. 12 of them were empty. The second time I came down here, I looked at in one day 13 houses. 9 of them were empty. Some of them were built in 2005 and had never been occupied. It is basically speculators that drove the property values up. And what's happening now for the builders is that you have speculators driving up the price of large parcels of land because they're basing their price and their valuations on the net present value of the future cash flows for those particular pieces of property. So if they tend to think that the county commission will take a piece of property that's zoned for 2 houses an acre and change the zoning to 5 houses per acre, then the speculators are in the market. And with the speculators in the market, they drive the price up so that the actual builders can't afford the property. So what you need to do as county commission is stick to your guns. Tell them, wait a minute, it's zoned for this, you bought it as this, it is this. If you take the speculators out of the market, you will find the market will go the same way that market went. It will go to where you have affordable parcels for the building community, the people that are actually going to build the affordable houses. Finally, I'd like to ask a couple of questions about the Collier County model. If we can see the slide that says gaps by land use Collier County, I would appreciate it. It has on there government use, industrial use, institutional use, office use, retail use, tourist use, so forth. And I would like to ask, in your model, did you include vacant property? Because I am also a property owner in Collier County, and I have watched the property taxes on my property in Marco Island double, triple, and quadruple. And if I look over here at the maintenance employment numbers for total dwelling units, mine isn't a dwelling unit, but I sure pay a lot of taxes. And if I look over here on assistance needed for teachers, firefighters, and police, my lot is a jungle. There's no firefighters needed. There's no teachers needed. There's no police needed for the gopher tortoises that live there. And so if you calculate your gap and you leave out the idea that there is a bunch of vacant land that has also went up in value significantly, that you're collecting taxes on and not providing any services for, then at that point, that gap, that statistic is skewed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Just
before he leaves, yeah. What was your name again?
My name is Jeff Wilsius.
Spell your last name.
Yeah.
W-I-L, T as in Tom, Z as in zebra, I-U-S as in Sam. It's pronounced will see us. It's a lot easier than it looks on.
If I remember playing Scrabble, I'm going to win the game if I ever get.
The thing I'd like to say is we don't have the ability to direct the property appraiser to how he assesses property, but your point's well taken. Yeah. I think you're right on target, and I agreed with everything you said.
I got a couple comments if I could. That a lot of what the problems that you're talking about have as far as the assessment, you should, your lot or whatever you have over in Collier County, you should fence it in and try to get an ag exemption on it somehow. Oh. But
they won't let me market the gopher tortoises.
You used to be able to. No.
We need some here.
But exactly what you're talking about, it's clearly a statewide issue, as you well know. I sit on the committee for the Florida Association of Counties that's dealing with the property tax structure, and I think we're going to see some relief come from the legislature. Unfortunately or fortunately, it's going to have to be through a constitutional amendment, because it was the Save Our Homes initiative that got us into the situation, and that's basically not spreading the tax burden evenly, for the lack of a better term. And that's my first point. The other one, I forget what it was, but as far as the second thing you talked about, the small lots and the density issue. We've recently modified our ordinances so that the small lot subdivision ordinance can only be used for affordable housing. And there are some instances up and down, I'll take 58th Avenue, for example, where you have the zero lot setbacks and the developments were pushed to the max, but there are $400,000 homes. That clearly wasn't the intent of the small lot ordinance, and therefore we have modified since then that ordinance to allow only affordable product to be built in small lot subdivision.
I do want to ask you a question, too. You asked us some. You probably know what percentage of vacant parcels are in your area that you're talking about. Is it very large, or?
In Central Beach?
Uh-huh.
It's hard to tell because
Right,
there's so many people
tell.
that are only wintertime residents. But it does bring up another point. One of the points that I would also like to make, I guess, is that in this county, you have watched the amount of revenue derived from property taxes outstrip the inflation rate and the growth rate by significant amounts. And one of the ways that you can offset that is simply roll back the mill rates, and that makes housing affordable for everybody. Now, a lot of times in a forum like this, well, that'll be a tax break for the rich. Yes, it will. But it also, if you look at Vero Beach, and I saw a headline that made me chuckle not too long ago that said Vero Beach is dependent on Social Security income from one of the workshops, and I had to laugh because I don't think that Social Security income is buying the condos out on Orchid and Hutchinson Island. But those make up another portion of the equation, because here today we've been talking about the supply side of the housing market, but you also have the demand side for the housing market. And when we start seeing property taxes driven up to the extent that they are right now because of the values, then it becomes less affordable even for the relatively affluent to continue to own those beachside condos. And if you have more supply of those condos coming online, what that does is it competes with the new development that's going on very close to my home and the new units that are coming online. And those units, if we stifle growth in those particular units, that is not just affecting the people that are the rich people. That's affecting the people that are building those, the construction workers, and the people that will work at those units once they're completed, and the people that, sell the $300 shoes out there on the beach. And that money flows. It flows not just one time through the economy, but it flows over and over and over again. And if you make it more affordable for everybody, including the rich, by rolling back the mill rates, you will encourage people to stay in this area. We have a lot of competition in other parts of the country in terms of where we can relocate. We can relocate to Tennessee. We don't have to relocate to Florida. And it is more affordable there than here. And so that's another solution that's in your hands. You can do it. You don't have to ask anybody, any outside agencies for help or solutions. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy?
Good afternoon, Commissioners and members of the audience. For the record, my name is Nancy Offit. I reside in Vero Beach on Date Palm, so I think that was my neighbor, though we haven't met. And I represent the Treasure Coast Builders Association. I've participated in several coalitions and summits on workforce housing. On the state level, I'm a member of the Workforce Housing Task Force, participated in the Florida Chamber of Commerce Affordable Housing Initiative, the Workforce Summit that was mentioned, and I'm least included on the roster of the Workforce Housing Task Force in Indian River, although I wasn't as much of a contributing member as some. And one of the reasons was that the builders have a dissenting opinion as it relates to inclusionary zoning. With everything else that's been said, we totally agree that workforce housing or the lack of affordable housing is a community-wide problem, and it needs to be addressed as on a community-wide basis. We don't deny that at all. And while Florida's home ownership rate stands at about 77%, which is very impressive, there are still thousands of families and people who are struggling to find housing that they can afford. And we understand that this does trickle down to the ability of businesses to come to our area and for people to maintain their homes and their lifestyles locally. As members of Florida, and it's a national issue, we have legally challenged the inclusionary zoning in Tallahassee. I did want to disclose that. We don't feel that inclusionary zoning is the answer. We feel that it targets one segment of the community for providing new construction that would be used for affordable housing, and we'd like to debate that at a separate forum, if that's possible, rather than go into it this afternoon. Several of the things that the builders have come up with as alternatives to inclusionary zoning do include broad-based solutions. We would like to see full funding, or at least broadened funding, of the Sadowski Act that captures those funds for SHIP programs. We'd like to see more of the employer-assisted housing that was described this afternoon. I think that when we have to subsidize housing, as Commissioner Wheeler pointed out, who are we really subsidizing? It's the bottom lines of the employers who fail to provide an adequate wage so people can live here. I think that needs to be addressed. We would also like to see integrated development between commercial and residential in mixed communities where there is less reliance on the automobile. Part of the workforce attainable lifestyle is really not only housing, it's the entire cost of living in our communities, the cost of a second automobile so you can travel a distance to get to work. That adds a significant burden on household income. So we'd like to see more integration in mixed-use communities. We'd like to point out that we think that regulations barriers are quite a disincentive to affect affordable housing. The new construction, part of that could be almost 1/3 of the overall cost can be in impact fees, permit fees, buffering requirements, some of the amenities that Mrs. White pointed out that are required do increase the cost of housing. In fact, I believe it was at yesterday's PSAC meeting, they talked about some of the increased buffering and landscaping criteria. All of these things affect the cost of housing. So with that said, we feel that Florida must be realistic in its approach to increasing workforce housing. As representing the Florida Association of Home Builders, we have about 21,000 corporate members who are very interested and looking forward to being part of the solution and supporting a broad-based approach to this community-wide problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Anyone else in the center section?
My name is Sumner Sharman. I live in Sebastian off of Louisiana Avenue. And I'm not an expert, guarantee that, with lots of experts here. I'm just a plain old citizen living here. But I noticed a lot of things that have come up, and a couple of things bother me. One is I watched a program the other night on TV on Channel 10 that they're talking about a lot of communities up north trying to get Piper to move there. And one of the things that Piper, one of the gentlemen from Piper said, they offer a lot of incentives like housing for the workforce, and we don't have it. So there are other things that they're looking at also. I think the commissioners can do a lot to help this situation. I've heard a lot of all these things that I don't even understand. The gentleman who is the economics major over here, or professor. Yeah, I understood what he was talking about. I went to Wharton School, so I understand some of the things you said, okay? Yeah. But a lot of the other things that you people like Dick Stark, and I understood some of the things he said, but other things I don't. Anyhow, the county owns a lot of land. And my kind of theory is that maybe some of that land could be used for the affordable housing. Maybe if you have a tract of land this size, whatever it is, has 4 sides, and you take the perimeter around, you put affordable housing on the perimeter, you still have the part in the middle, and you got a lot of eyes looking to see that nothing's going to happen to what goes on inside. So I think that, hey, wait a minute. A lot of things go on in those places that you... Here's a gentleman who's been here in this county all his life, and I've been here for 35 years. And I remember when... good music. I remember when Vera Lake Estates was the major source of pot for this community. I think Wes does too. Am I right, Wes? Huh?
No comment.
I mean, that's where that all came. They grew it out there. Believe me, they did.
Yeah, that was the ag exemption for those lots, right?
But that goes back a long time before they had a lot of houses out there. And nobody was watching, so it went on. But what I'm saying is, you have a lot of empty land that somebody should be watching and see who's growing pot on that land right now. I'm not saying they do, because I'm too old to smoke the damn stuff. Anyhow, I travel a little bit, and I've traveled in the past, and I was up in the Princeton-Pennington area up in New Jersey not too long ago, and they have what they call campuses, and they mix residential and industrial R&D in these campuses, and they blend them beautifully, and they have areas where there's some very high-priced homes, they have areas where there are workforce-type homes, all mixed in with the R&D and the industrial, like Squibb is one of the big ones up there, and all around Squibb, and they have a tremendous development of buildings, not just 1 or 2, but a lot. And all around it, they have the same thing. People are very close to where they work, and they don't seem to have a problem. Now, they don't put a $250,000 house here and a $5 million house next door to it. They do segregate it somewhat and kind of blend it in around. So they've done a great job, and I think that's something that could be done here as well. The other thing I've wanted to mention was the construction. I'm helping a fellow who's older than I am, and a friend of Dick Stark's, who is well up in his 80s, and I've gotten a little experience in construction, not a heck of a lot, and I don't want to anymore. I've retired 30 years ago. Anyhow, I like the idea that you can, some of the new features of methods of building could be incorporated into some of these houses and reduce the cost. Another suggestion I have is these impact fees, which amount to about $10,000 as I understand it from what happens when you build a house. Why couldn't they be spread out over a period of time rather than always up front? If they spread them out over 10 years, because if you put, we'll say $5,000 into the traffic impact fee, you're not going to spend that $5,000 tomorrow morning when I give you the 10 or 5,000. It goes into a fund. It's used down the road. So why couldn't it be put in down the road over a period of time? That's just, you're mitigating the fees to some degree. Just a couple ideas. I'd like to sit down sometime when more people like me, because I'm not belittling anything the experts have said. I don't understand some of it, so maybe you all do. But I have fun doing it anyhow. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else in the center section? Not anybody over on the left?
That's good. I'm watching you.
Watching him?
Watching you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Spencer Simmons. Simmons Homes. I build homes here. Always thought about the workforce housing, but I always looked at it from taking a bite of the apple from the other end. We're always looking at the workforce housing and attainable housing, and it always seems like we're trying to bring the common denominator down instead of bringing people up. And all this attainable and job related is related to the income, and that's all related to jobs. And Indian River County is unique, as everybody keeps talking about, because they do have available land that, if it's used properly, would give us more industry and more jobs here to actually bring the level of incomes up instead of having to drop the housing prices down. And I know that on one of the papers here for 2003, workforce, retail, hotel, and restaurant was the largest employers, and we all know they don't make a lot of money. You go down, you got your service professionals, and then construction. And construction is starting to peter out because of 2004 and 2005. It will pick back up, but it won't quite be what it was then, and I hope it doesn't and keeps us smaller builders in business. But if you continue to look through their little list of employers, when you get down to the manufacturing and transportation, there are just not that many jobs here. Either you're working in a hotel or you're a doctor taking care of, the elderly off the beach or that, and there's just nothing else around here for income. I hear a lot of paper shuffling ideals, because that seems a lot of what it's doing. Let's get a committee to do this, and we'll get a committee to look at that, and I don't really see that it's going to solve a lot. Government, in my 43 years on this planet, has done little to solve very few problems. The community land trust is another situation. I think it might work for a little bit, but anytime nobody doesn't own their own property, it's just going to peter out, and it's not going to be taken care of. The homes are no longer an investment, something that you've attained. You're just kind of renting it, and you're going to take care of it until the next guy comes along, and I don't think that's going to work real good. I think that if you're looking at some of those ideals, it just, to me, becomes the government's going to become a landlord, and you're just going to have a nanny state when you're dealing with that. We hear a lot about the employer assisting housing and having employers assist people. Well, we need employers. We need a little higher paying employers than what we have available in the community. I think that would help out the situation greatly on it, giving people a chance to raise their incomes up and be able to afford a house they want, not one that we're going to help them get, because no matter how you shake this tree, that money's coming from us. The SHIP program, all this government funding, all this is still coming from the taxpayers, and you don't even have a very large tax base to pull all this money from to turn around and give it back to the same people, and there's no real jobs to do it. We need to, kind of raise the boats a little bit up, bring the people up to a level that where they have an opportunity to get a good paying job, and there are always going to be, people that need assistance, but you're going to have a larger pool to pull from. And then somebody has something to look forward to attain to get a better job. So I think maybe try to look at it from the other end, and in Bristol-Myers Squibbs, you have all this biotech that everybody seems to be hunting for. Maybe we need to start looking at what we can do as a commission, as the county, to start drawing in some more high-paying jobs. Work with zoning regulations to get, because we do have a lot of land out there, especially west of 95, that industry is going to want. I believe there was a workshop last week, and there was an economist said exactly that Indian River County does have larger parcels west. We have 95, we have the Turnpike, and we have State Road 60, so we're situated in a good position to actually start looking at industries to come here, because they have a lot of traffic, they have a lot of ways to get their products out. We do have enough workers to get people in here, and once there's more jobs, you'll be able to, bring more workers in and build better houses, and there'll be a better opportunity for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Yeah, one more. Sure.
Traditionally, there has been some misinformation and ideas about manufactured housing communities, and I just wanted to invite everybody here on the committee and everybody here in the audience to please stop by and take a look at what some of these houses are like. Because if the goal is truly to provide affordable homes for people, to be able to buy a home for $79,000 is something tremendous, and it's affordable. So please come and I welcome you. We're having an open house this weekend. Please come and see the homes and for yourself. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any,
Sir, I wanted to ask, during the slump, while there is a slump, is there anything that's able to be done, number one? And number two, are you able to go into neighborhoods where there are large blocks of vacated, vacant homes to do anything? Those are the only questions I have.
any comments, closing remarks from the commission? Wesley?
I'm good.
Peter?
I think we've heard a wide range of potential options here, all the way from kind of one thing I've always thought is let the private market forces continue at work. And we have seen the housing prices are coming down quite rapidly. We had a kind of a boom there in real estate and speculative real estate market, and that bubble has popped. And I think a lot of realtors will tell you, if you look at the MLS listings, there are quite a few homes listed now at 150 or less. So there is some opportunities out there, just letting the market forces work through these cycles that you're going to have. There's also a lot of other things to do, the community land trust, inclusionary zoning, property tax relief, and certainly all good ideas, increasing wage opportunities, better industry. So I think we have a lot of things we can work with and deal with. I do like the suggestion of recreating the housing committee and maybe the Affordable Housing Coalition. I think you all said you would step up and spearhead that. I think I don't know how much action we can take here today, Mr. Chairman, but we probably do need to do something to keep this momentum going and not just let it die out and come back 10 years from now. So I would like to at least see us either give staff some type of direction or to take all these ideas we've had and start walking through some of these options and see what we can do.
I think that's a good idea. I enjoyed this whole presentation, everyone's presentation, all the hard work you did, but staff is our point persons, and would like for them to decipher all this and perhaps bring us back something, some bullet points or something we can really get our teeth in.
Joe, any comments? Hey, the only comments I have, just a couple of comments on what was said earlier. Everything's got a lead and a lag. I learned that with compasses, flying and boating. And our economy is no different. There's a lead and a lag with our housing, with the bubble we just went through. And I think, things get overpriced and then they drop back. They won't go back where they were, but they're getting more attainable than they were. The other thing that was mentioned was when an employer has a hard time filling jobs because there's no affordable housing, well, that should give the incentive to the employer to start raising salaries. When you go to larger cities like New York City and other places, I just pick that as an example, salaries are much higher. A police officer here might make $36,000 a year, and maybe in New York City he's making $70,000 a year because of the difference in the cost of living. And these are some of the things I think that we're overlooking. And a lot of the things that we all know that figures don't lie, but I think a lot of the stuff and a lot of the figures that anybody puts together, you take different economists. In fact, in watching the media and stuff, I don't know if you can find two economists that agree on a lot of things, kind of like lawyers. They can take a side of an issue and justify it somehow. I think wages are a serious problem every place. Also, the question I have is, and one other comment mentioned the older gentleman. I think you're right. That's what I think we're doing, kind of a circle. We're kind of moving back toward the way they built communities in the turn of the century, 1900, 1890s, where people lived over businesses and people were in walking distance of the town center. There's a lot of that going on now, and I think it's history repeating itself. A lot of the new developments all over the country are doing that, and we're no exception. I don't think they've caught on completely yet, public transportation, save on cars. But my big question is, and I heard from some people in the audience, taxes. You know, the nasty word taxes, I don't like them any better than anybody else does. If you're homesteaded, you've been living in your house since 1995, you're paying less taxes today than you were then, and that's not adjusted for inflation. You adjust it for inflation, and you're paying a whole lot less money in Florida if you were homesteaded and living in your house since 95 than you're paying today in taxes. Businesses and non-homesteaded properties, rental units, that's who's carrying the burden. So my question is, and all of this that we heard today, who can disagree with it? It's like motherhood and apple pie. Let's help somebody that needs help. But who's going to help them, and with whose money, and how does that work? Who's going to pay for it? And that's my biggest question. Who's going to pay for it? So my task to staff would be, first, as you go through this, as the commission would like, as you go through this and look at it, first, I want to know what the cost is. Secondly, I want to know what the revenue source is. And what are we going to raise in taxes, or what are we going to cut in services to provide these benefits? And when I get that, then I can make more reasonable decisions about where we ought to go and what approach we should take to this. And that's me. That's it for me. So if there's nothing else, the other thing is let me explain to some people, we really can't take any action today specifically because this is a workshop. So we've given, I guess there's a consensus here that we've given some direction to staff. Does anybody disagree with any of the direction? And staff will come back with this, and if we need to have another workshop, we can certainly schedule that. But I'd like to get some numbers together and some possibilities from staff as they go through this and digest it also. So with that, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.